A man wrote 3 sentences to a matrimonial agency asking for a practical wife. Plain, hardworking, built for survival. The woman who stepped off the train wore a suit that cost more than his best horse, carried herself like someone who had never scrubbed a floor in her life, and brought with her an iron-bound trunk locked 3 times over that no ordinary bride could afford or explain. Colton Hayes looked at her on that platform and knew immediately this was not the woman he had asked for. But the woman he had asked for would not have looked at him with eyes that said she had already survived something far worse than Wyoming. Hidden inside that trunk were legal documents, bank drafts, and a fortune large enough to buy half the territory, along with evidence that powerful men in Chicago had tried to have her declared insane and locked away rather than let her inherit what was rightfully hers. She had not come to Wyoming to find a husband. She had come to disappear. What she had not planned for was a 7-year-old girl with a broken doll, a blizzard that would kill a man in 40 minutes, and a rancher stubborn enough to take her at her word when no one else would. Hit like, comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The train was late. Colton Hayes had been standing on the Laramie platform for 40 minutes in the July heat, and he'd already run out of patience somewhere around the 30-minute mark. He had cattle to move, a fence line down on the north pasture, and 3 ranch hands who would accomplish exactly nothing without someone watching them. He had not planned to spend his Tuesday morning at a train station. He had also not planned to spend it at all, if he was being honest with himself. The whole business had been his sister Ruth's idea, argued across his kitchen table in February with the particular persistence Ruth reserved for things she had already decided on his behalf. He needed someone to help with May. He needed someone who could manage a house. He needed, Ruth had said with the careful diplomatic phrasing of someone who had thought about this longer than she was letting on, someone to make the place feel like a home again. He had not argued that last point, which said something. The letter he'd sent to the Hargrove Matrimonial Agency in Chicago had been 3 sentences long. He wanted a woman accustomed to hard work, someone practical, without expectations about luxury or comfort, someone who understood that Wyoming in winter was not a romantic prospect. He'd received back a single letter from a Miss Evelyn Ashcroft, which had been brief enough to satisfy him and direct enough that he'd figured she understood what she was signing up for. She wrote that she was capable of managing a household, that she had no aversion to difficult conditions, and that she wished to make herself useful. She had not sent a photograph. He had not asked for one. He watched the locomotive pull in with May's hand tucked in his, the girl pressed against his leg with her rag doll held tight to her chest. May was 7, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of going very still when she was nervous about something. She'd been still a lot these past 2 years. "Is she coming on this train?" May asked. "That's what the telegram said." "What does she look like?" "I don't know." May considered this. "How will we know which one is her? I imagine she'll find us." The passengers came off the platform in the usual disorder. Ranch hands and traveling salesmen, and a group of women who'd come up from Denver for reasons that were none of his business. He scanned for someone practical-looking, someone in sensible clothes with a sensible traveling bag, and the expression of a woman who had made a considered decision. He almost missed her. She came off the train last, which he would later think was significant, though he couldn't have said why. She stood at the top of the steps and paused, taking in the platform and the dust and the baking summer heat with an expression that was perfectly composed. Not the expression of a woman arriving somewhere new, but the expression of a woman who had spent a long time practicing not letting anything show on her face. She was not what he had expected. He had expected plain. He had asked for plain, Miss. Not in those words, but that had been the underlying understanding. What stood at the top of those steps was not plain by any definition of the word that Colton Hayes was familiar with. She was dressed in a deep green traveling suit that had not come from a department store, with a hat that matched and gloves that were already drawing stares from the 2 women nearest the platform doors. She carried a leather bag that probably cost more than his best saddle. Behind her, 2 porters were struggling with an iron-bound trunk the size of a small wardrobe. Colton stared at the trunk. Then he looked back at the woman. Then he looked at May, who had gone very still beside him. The woman descended the steps, spoke a brief word to the porters, and then turned and found him with her eyes across the platform with an accuracy that suggested she'd already figured out who he was before she'd even come off the train. She walked toward him with the kind of posture that certain women acquired from certain schools, and never entirely lost, regardless of how far they traveled from wherever they'd started. She stopped 2 feet from him and extended her hand. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Evelyn Ashcroft." He shook it. Her grip was firm and her eyes were direct, and they were watching him with an attention that felt uncomfortably like being assessed. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. A pause stretched between them. He was aware that he was staring, and that staring was rude, and that he was doing it anyway. "You're not what I expected," he said. Something shifted behind her eyes, quick and contained. "No," she said. "I don't imagine I am." He looked past her at the trunk. "What's in there?" "My belongings." "All of them?" "The ones I brought." He looked at the trunk again. The iron bands on it were not decorative. They were functional, and they were locked, and there were 3 separate locks that he could count from where he was standing. "That trunk's going to be a problem to load." "I can help with the loading." He looked at her hands, still gloved. He looked at her suit. He looked at her hat. "Right," he said. She could not help with the loading. She stood beside the wagon and watched him and his ranch hand, Frank, wrestle the trunk into the bed with the careful, focused expression of someone who had decided that offering to help a second time would not improve the situation. She was right about that. Colton didn't say anything about it. Frank said a great deal, mostly under his breath in language he appeared to think May couldn't hear, which was a miscalculation because May heard everything and stored it away with the quiet efficiency of a creature that had learned to pay close attention to the world around her. The drive to the ranch took an hour and 40 minutes on a good road. This was not a good road. It had rained 3 days ago, and the ruts had hardened into ridges, and the wagon lurched and jolted in ways that Colton had long since stopped noticing, and that Evelyn Ashcroft absorbed with a stillness that struck him as either great composure or great stubbornness. Probably both. May sat between them on the bench seat, the rag doll in her lap, and watched Evelyn with the kind of open, unguarded attention that children could get away with and adults couldn't. "What's your doll's name?" Evelyn asked about 20 minutes into the drive. May looked at her steadily. "Agnes." "Agnes is a good name for a doll." "Her arm is torn," May said. "Papa tried to fix it, but he doesn't know how to sew." "I can see that." There was no mockery in it. Evelyn glanced at the doll's arm, where a length of rough twine held the seam together with the particular desperation of someone who had tried to solve a problem with the wrong tool. "Would you like me to try?" May looked at her father. Colton kept his eyes on the road. "Up to you," he said. May turned back to Evelyn. "Maybe," she said. It was the most she'd offered a stranger in a long time. But the ranch house was a 2-story structure that Colton's father had built in 1871, and that Colton had added to over the years with the practical unsentimentality of a man building something to function rather than to impress. It was solid. The roof was good. The kitchen was larger than it had any right to be, which had been his wife Clara's doing, and the main room had a fireplace that drew well and windows that faced east so the mornings were bright. He watched Evelyn take it in from the front door and tried to read her face. She had very good control of her face. "It's not what you're used to," he said. He hadn't meant it as an apology exactly, but it came out sounding like one. She turned and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not offense, not disappointment, something more complicated than either. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I don't know that you know what I'm used to." "No," he admitted. "I don't." She walked inside. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the back of her green jacket disappear into the dimness of the front room, and had the particular feeling of a man who has just agreed to something he doesn't fully understand. The first meal she cooked was not good. That was too mild. The first meal she cooked was a disaster in the particular way that disasters are when someone attempts something they have never done before with the confidence of someone who has watched it done and believes that to understand a thing in theory is to understand it in practice. The salt was wrong. The heat was wrong. What had been intended as a beef stew arrived at the table as something considerably more geological in character. May prodded at it with her fork. Frank, who had stayed for supper with the easy assumption of a man who had been eating at this table for 6 years, took one bite and then took a second bite out of what Colton recognized as pure charity, and then set his fork down with the expression of someone accepting a difficult situation. Colton ate it. He ate all of it slowly, without comment. Evelyn sat across the table and watched him do it, And when he finished, she said, "That was not edible." "It was fine," he said. "It was not fine. I overheated the fat, and then I added too much water, and then I added salt twice because I lost track, and the result was not something a person should have to eat." She picked up her own fork and took a careful bite and chewed and set the fork down. "I need to learn how to use that stove." "Most people do," he said. "Takes a while." "Do you have a cookbook?" "Clara had one. I'll find it." She nodded. She did not apologize for the meal again, which he found himself respecting more than he might have expected. Frank left shortly after supper with the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment, and Colton washed the dishes himself because Evelyn was already studying Clara's cookbook at the table with the focused intensity of someone preparing for an examination. May had fallen asleep on the sofa. The lamp threw a warm circle across the table and Evelyn's bent head, and for a moment the house felt less empty than it had in a long time, which was an observation Colton made and then deliberately did not think about further. She burned breakfast too. Not as badly as supper. The eggs were scorched on the bottom, but edible in the middle, and the bread was merely stale rather than carbonized. She stood at the stove with the cookbook propped on the shelf above it, and followed instructions with the methodical attention of someone who had decided that failure was a problem to be solved, rather than a verdict on her character. "You've never cooked before," he said. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, watching her work. "Not like this," she said. "What does that mean?" She moved the pan off the direct heat. "I've been in kitchens. I've watched cooking being done. That's not the same as doing it." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She scraped the eggs onto a plate and handed it to him and stood across the kitchen looking at it critically. The heat was still too high. "Little bit. I'll get it right." He believed her. He wasn't sure why. There wasn't any evidence yet to support the conclusion, but there was something in the way she said it that didn't sound like optimism. It sounded like a statement of fact about the future, the way you might say the sun would rise. She moved to the window and looked out at the yard. The morning light came in sideways and lit the side of her face, and he saw, briefly, something underneath the composure, something tired and watchful that had been there longer than she'd been in this house. "The women in town," he said. "They'll want to meet you. Ruth, my sister, she'll come by, probably within the week. She'll bring food as an excuse." Evelyn turned from the window. "Is she coming to be friendly or to inspect me?" He considered lying. "Both," he said. A very small something moved at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood. "Good," she said. "I'd rather know what I'm dealing with." Ruth came on a Thursday with a pie and an expression of pure, determined warmth that Colton recognized as the face she used when she was prepared to like something, whether it deserved it or not. She liked Evelyn. That surprised him. Ruth was protective of May in the particular fierce way of a woman who has appointed herself a child's guardian in the absence of its mother, and she had argued for this arrangement and organized it and written 3 letters to the matrimonial agency. And she still arrived with the pie and the scrutiny of a woman who was not entirely certain she hadn't made a mistake. By the end of the visit, she was sitting at Colton's kitchen table laughing at something Evelyn had said, and Evelyn was leaning against the counter with the cookbook open in front of her, asking Ruth about the temperature of the stove because the cookbook's instructions assumed a wood range, and this stove ran hot on the left side, and Ruth was explaining the trick of it with the evangelical enthusiasm she brought to anything she actually knew well. Colton sat on the porch and listened through the open window and understood that something had happened in there that he hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite name. Later, walking back to the barn, Ruth fell into step beside him. She was quiet for a moment, which with Ruth meant something was being organized behind the quiet. "She's not what I expected," Ruth said. "No," he said. "She's not." "Where do you think she came from?" He looked at her sideways. "Chicago. The letter said Chicago." "I know what the letter said." Ruth stopped at the barn door. "Colton, that suit she came in, I know what that suit costs. I've seen those suits in the catalog. And the trunk." "What about it?" "It weighs more than furniture. I heard Frank talking about it." She looked at him steadily. "Who carries furniture in a trunk?" He didn't have an answer for that. "I'm not saying anything bad," Ruth said quickly. "I'm just saying she's running from something. or she's hiding from something, and whatever it is, she's worked very hard to make sure it doesn't show. That's her business, Colton said. Ruth looked at him a moment longer with the expression she'd had since childhood when she thought he was being deliberately obtuse. Right, she said. Just be careful. She walked back to her buggy. He stood at the barn door and watched her go. And behind him in the house he could hear Evelyn's voice and the sound of the stove being banked for the evening, and May's voice asking something that made Evelyn laugh, and the sound of it carried across the yard in the warm evening air with the ordinary quality of a household in motion, which was something this place had not been for 2 years. He went inside. By the 3rd week, she had gotten the eggs right. Not perfect. She burned the toast on the 2nd morning of that week and oversalted the potatoes twice, but the eggs were consistently good, and the coffee was excellent from the very start, which she'd explained once was because she had very fixed opinions about coffee and had paid attention to those from the first day. She had also begun the laundry without being asked, which led to the discovery that she did not know how to operate the washboard, which led to a 40-minute lesson from Ruth, who had appeared without announcement, as she tended to, that ended with Evelyn's gloves abandoned on the porch railing and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair escaping from its pins, working the washboard with a focused grimness that reminded Colton of the face she'd made over the stew. She wasn't complaining. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She was failing at things, not dramatically but consistently, in the way of someone learning an entirely new set of skills from scratch. And she was doing it without complaint and without self-pity and without what he had half expected, which was the suggestion that these tasks were beneath her. He caught himself watching her more than he should. He noticed when she moved the furniture slightly, positioning the chairs to catch the morning light. He noticed that she'd found Clara's dried herbs in the pantry and started using them, carefully at first and then with more confidence. He noticed that she sat with May in the evenings after supper and let the girl talk without directing the conversation, just listening with the particular quality of attention that May, who had been talked over and talked around for 2 years, clearly found remarkable. May had started bringing Agnes to the supper table again. She hadn't done that since the previous winter. Shock. The trunk stayed locked. He wasn't looking for it. He noticed because it was impossible not to notice. The thing sat against the wall of the room she'd been given, and it was the most locked object he had ever seen in his life. And there were 3 different locks on it, and she had the keys on her person at all times. He knew because he had never once seen the keys anywhere except on the chain she wore under her collar. He did not ask about it. He had told Ruth it was her business, and he meant it. But he thought about what Ruth had said. That suit and the quality of her speech and the way she sometimes slipped into language that was too precise, too formal, like someone who had learned to talk plain but sometimes forgot to and caught herself and corrected. The way she occasionally went still in a specific way, not the stillness of someone thinking, but the stillness of someone listening for something. And the letters. She received no letters. She sent none, as far as he could tell, which was unusual for a woman newly arrived somewhere. Most people, even practical people, wrote home. She had not written to anyone in the 3 weeks she'd been here. He told himself he was imagining things. He focused on the fence line and the cattle and the negotiations with the Water Rights Association that were going badly for reasons that were going to require legal attention before winter. He had enough to think about without speculating about the woman in his house. And then he found her in the barn at midnight. He'd gotten up because one of the horses was restless. He'd heard it from his window. And when he came in with the lantern, she was already there, standing at the stall of the older gelding, talking to it in a low voice. She had a lantern of her own, turned low, and she was still fully dressed, which meant she hadn't been in bed. She turned when she heard him, and for one moment, just one before the composure came back down, he saw something raw cross her face. Fear, and then relief, and then the careful blankness. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Me either." He came and stood beside her. The horse, Walter, was calm now, his large head swinging toward them both with the uncomplicated trust of an animal that had been handled well. He does this sometimes, probably a coyote earlier. "I heard him from my window." "You were awake anyway," he said. Not a question. She was quiet for a moment. The lantern made long shadows up the barn walls, and Walter blew softly through his nose, and somewhere in the rafters a barn owl shuffled on its beam. "Sometimes I have trouble sleeping," she said. "That's all." "Fair enough. He stayed a while longer than was necessary, partly because the company of the horse was settling in the way horses always were, and partly because she looked, in the low light, less like the composed and careful woman who had stepped off the train and more like a person carrying something heavy for a very long time alone. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask, but he went back to the house with the understanding that Ruth had been right. Evelyn Ashcroft was hiding from something or someone, and that whatever it was serious enough that she couldn't sleep, and serious enough that she'd traded a life that had included servants and expensive luggage for burned eggs and a washboard in Wyoming. That was, he thought, worth paying attention to. The neighbor situation was more complicated. There were 7 ranches within a day's ride of the Hayes property, and their owners existed in the particular arrangement of people who depended on each other for survival and therefore could not afford to like or dislike each other too openly. Colton had worked alongside most of them for years. He was not close to any of them, which was a characteristic of his that Ruth occasionally pointed out, and that he did not particularly intend to change. They came, one by one or in pairs, over the course of Evelyn's first month. They came with the stated purpose of welcoming the new bride and the actual purpose of forming an opinion. Colton could not stop them. He could and did make clear, through the specific quality of his silence, that he would not be discussing Evelyn's background or the contents of her trunk or the price of her traveling suit. Most of them were decent people conducting an understandable human impulse. Hester Malone was not. Hester was the wife of Dale Malone, whose property abutted Colton's to the south, and she was the kind of woman who understood the social architecture of a community with the precision of an engineer and had spent 30 years placing herself at its center. She arrived with her daughter Caroline on a Wednesday afternoon and accepted coffee with a graciousness that was also, unmistakably, performance. "You come from Chicago," Hester said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Evelyn said. "The agency, Hargroves, they place women from all walks of life, I understand." "I believe so." Hester smiled at her coffee. "It's an interesting choice for a woman like yourself. With your—" She paused, measuring the pause. "Your presentation. Most women of quality don't come to us by way of a matrimonial agency." The kitchen went very quiet. Caroline Malone, who was 17 and had her mother's eyes and none of her mother's nerves, studied the table. Evelyn set her coffee cup down with a small, clean click. "Hester," she said, "I've found that how a woman arrives somewhere matters a great deal less than what she does once she gets there. Don't you think?" Hester's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind it. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Would you like more coffee?" Colton, who had been standing in the doorway with the specific invisible quality he had developed over years of not wanting to be in conversations, watched Hester Malone accept more coffee and watched Evelyn pour it, and thought that whatever Evelyn Ashcroft had been before she came here, she was not someone who could be easily maneuvered. After they left, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window for a long moment looking out at the yard. "She'll talk," Colton said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "She will." A pause. "Does it matter what she says?" He thought about it honestly. "To some people, the ones who care about that kind of thing." She turned from the window. "And you?" "I care about who does the work and how they treat the people around them," he said. "I haven't had any complaints on either front." She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, not quite surprise, but something in that neighborhood. Like a woman who had expected something and was recalibrating in the face of not receiving it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back to the barn, which was his usual destination when a conversation had arrived somewhere he didn't know how to navigate. The doll happened at the end of the 4th week. May had Agnes at the table when the stitching on her arm finally gave out completely. The twine Colton had used, which had never been the right material, worked loose during supper and the arm came free, and May went absolutely rigid in the way she had when she was fighting not to cry. "May," Colton started. "I can fix it," Evelyn said. She was already pushing back from the table. "May, can I see her?" May looked at her, then at her father, then held Agnes out. Evelyn took the doll with both hands and examined the arm with careful attention, and then said, "I'll need my sewing kit. Do you want to come?" May slid off her chair. They went upstairs and Colton sat at the table with the uneaten second half of his supper and listened to footsteps overhead and then the particular sound of the trunk being unlocked. He hadn't thought about that until later. She'd unlocked the trunk. He heard May's voice and Evelyn's lower response, and then May's voice again, and then silence, and then May's voice again. And this went on for some time. When they came back downstairs, Agnes had a new seam on her arm stitched with gold thread. Actual gold thread, fine as a hair, that caught the lamplight when May tilted the doll. She used the gold because she said Agnes deserved something special, May told him seriously. Because Agnes has had a hard time. That's right, Evelyn said, and sat back down at the table and picked up her fork. Colton looked at the doll and then at Evelyn, and she was already eating again, cutting a piece of carrot with the focused precision of someone who had somewhere along the line gotten very comfortable with deflecting attention from herself. He looked down at his plate, the carrot, the beef, the potatoes, which were almost right this time. He picked up his fork. Thank you, he said. She's a good doll, Evelyn said. She deserved the good thread. May sat across the table examining Agnes's arm in the lamplight with the expression of someone who has been given something back that she'd stopped expecting to have again. Colton watched her for a moment and then looked at Evelyn, who was not watching May, which he understood was deliberate, giving the child space to have the feeling without being observed having it. The lamplight moved. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the Wyoming summer pressed against the windows with all of its vastness and its silence. And inside the kitchen, the three of them sat at the table in the particular quiet of people who have not yet become a family but have begun, without deciding to move in that direction. Colton had been careful not to think about that. He found it was getting harder to avoid. Oh, he tried asking her, once, directly. It was a Saturday evening, May already in bed, and he'd come in from checking on the north water trough to find Evelyn at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the same expression she had in the barn at midnight, that look of someone listening for something that wasn't there yet. He pulled out a chair across from her and sat down without preamble. You're hiding from someone, he said. She looked at him steadily. Not denial, not confirmation, just steady. I don't know what you're running from, he said, and you don't have to tell me. But if someone's going to show up on my land looking for you, I'd like to know about it before they arrive. A long silence. She turned the glass in her hands, turning it and turning it. No one will come looking, she said at last. I was very careful. How careful? Careful enough that they wouldn't think to look here. Something shifted in her face, not quite bitterness, but close to it. A mail-order bride in Wyoming is the last thing anyone would expect. He let that sit for a moment. Who is they? She looked at him directly. People who want something I have and believe they have a right to take it. What do they think gives them that right? Her jaw tightened slightly. Family, she said. The word came out with the particular flatness of something she had thought about a great deal and arrived at no comfortable conclusion about. Or what passes for it. He nodded slowly. He didn't push. He'd gotten more than he'd expected. If that changes, he said, if someone does come, tell me. She held his gaze. Why? The question seemed genuine, like she actually didn't know why he would make that offer. That bothered him more than the secrets in the trunk. Because you're on my land, he said, and that means something. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, all right. He got up and put his chair back and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the Wyoming wind work through the grass outside the window and thinking about a woman who had learned not to expect that being somewhere meant you were safe there. The conversation Colton and Evelyn had in the kitchen on that Saturday night did not get repeated. That was by unspoken agreement, the kind that forms between people who have said what needed saying and understand that returning to it will not produce more than what was already given. She had told him enough. He had told her enough. They went back to the business of the ranch and the daily accumulation of tasks that kept two people too occupied for sustained reflection. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, even if neither one mentioned it. He stopped watching her with suspicion. He still watched her. He was aware of that, more aware than he was comfortable with. But the quality of the watching had changed. It was less about trying to catch something she was hiding and more the involuntary attention of a man who had gotten used to someone being around and found that he noticed when they weren't. She noticed things too. He caught her watching him work from the kitchen window, not with any particular expression, just the level attention she brought to most things. He caught her filing away small details about the ranch, the timing of his rounds, which horses needed what, the sequence of tasks that kept a property this size running, with the systematic precision of someone who had decided to understand the place rather than just inhabit it. Ruth noticed all of this naturally. Ruth noticed everything. "You seem less miserable," she told Colton one afternoon, helping him haul water to the garden Evelyn had started along the south wall. "I wasn't miserable before." "Colton, I have known you for 34 years. He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. "She's doing well," Ruth said, in the careful tone of a woman making an observation she hopes will not be argued with. "Better than I expected, honestly. And I expected better than you expected, which tells you something." "She's working hard," he said. "I'll give her that. More than hard." Ruth set her pail down and looked at the garden, which was small and imperfect, and clearly the work of someone who had read about gardening and was now finding out what reading had left out. 2 of the rows were too close together. One had been planted too shallow, and the seeds were already washing out. Evelyn had noticed this herself and replanted that section twice in the past week, each time with slightly better results. "She doesn't quit," Ruth said. "Whatever she came from, whatever she's running from, she doesn't quit." "No," he said, "she doesn't." Ruth picked her pail back up. "May likes her." "I know. May doesn't like anybody." He thought about Agnes's golden thread catching the lamplight and May's face when she'd tilted the doll. "She likes the right people," he said. "She just takes her time about it." Ruth looked at him for a moment with an expression that was equal parts fond and exasperated. "I'm going to say one thing and then I'm going to stop talking about it," she said. "All right. Don't be an idiot." She walked back to the house. He stood by the garden with his empty pail and thought that was probably the most useful advice anyone had given him in 2 years, and also thought that taking it was going to be considerably more complicated than Ruth seemed to believe. The garden became Evelyn's project in the way that certain tasks become a person's when they've decided to own them fully, rather than merely perform them. She was out there most mornings before breakfast, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, working with the patient stubbornness of someone who has decided to learn a thing through the doing of it, regardless of how many times the doing of it goes wrong. She killed 2 rows of carrots by overwatering. She replanted them. She staked the beans wrong and they fell over and she restaked them. She found a copy of an agricultural almanac in the bottom of Colton's bookshelf and read it cover to cover at the kitchen table one evening, making small marks in the margins in a handwriting so precise it looked engraved. "You're not supposed to write in borrowed books," May told her seriously. "You're right," Evelyn said. "Do you think he'll mind?" May considered the question with the gravity she brought to matters of household rule. "You could ask." "I could," Evelyn agreed. "Or I could hope he doesn't look at it too closely." "That's not very honest." "You're correct. It's not." She looked at May over the top of the almanac. "What would you do?" May thought about it. "I'd tell him," she said finally, "because then it's over and you don't have to keep thinking about it." Evelyn looked at the child for a moment with an expression Colton caught from across the room. Something that moved across her face too quickly to name, but that left a trace of something unguarded behind it. "That's very smart," she said. "Mama said worrying about getting caught is worse than just saying what you did." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms do when a dead person is unexpectedly brought into them. Colton at the stove kept his back turned and kept his hands still and waited. "She sounds like she was wise," Evelyn said. Her voice was careful, not overly gentle, not treating the subject like something that would break, just honest. "She was," May said. "She was also very funny. Papa's not funny." "Hey," Colton said from the stove. May looked at him. "You're not." "Thank you, May." "You're serious. It's different." Evelyn made a sound that was definitely a laugh, quickly converted into something else. He turned around to look at her, and she had her face carefully composed and her eyes on the almanac, and he thought, not for the first time, that she had a great deal of practice not laughing at things. "The almanac," he said. "You can write in it." She looked up. "I already did." "I know, I saw." He turned back to the stove. "Just put it back where you found it when you're done." A pause. Then, "Thank you." The word had a weight to it that didn't match the occasion, which was an almanac, and he thought that was because she wasn't really thanking him for the almanac. He understood that and didn't say so. The distance between them in those weeks was the particular distance of two people who are circling something without acknowledging they're circling it. They ate together and worked in proximity and spoke about the ranch and May and the weather and the neighbors and the state of the North Pasture with the easy fluency of people who had shared space long enough to develop a language for it. They did not speak about Chicago or the trunk or why a woman who clearly knew things that required expensive schools had ended up kneeling in a Wyoming garden over a row of failed carrots. He thought about it anyway. He thought about it more than he should have, and more than he would have admitted to anyone, including himself in the clearer moments. She was careful about the trunk. She unlocked it when she needed something from it and locked it again immediately after, with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that it wasn't a choice anymore but a reflex. He had been in her room twice, once to fix a window latch that had come loose, once to return a lamp she'd lent to the barn, and both times the trunk had been locked and sitting exactly where she always kept it, against the wall under the window. An iron-banded fact of the room that declined to explain itself. He was not a man who went through other people's things. He had the patience of someone who had spent years working with animals that could sense uncertainty, and he applied it here. You waited, you stayed consistent, and you let the thing come to you in its own time. What he hadn't expected was that the thing that came to him first was the town. Laramie was not a large place, but it had the social architecture of communities that have had time to establish opinions, and Hester Malone, true to Colton's prediction, had done her work. By the 6th week of Evelyn's arrival, the story that was circulating, which Colton heard in fragments from Frank and from the feed store owner, and from Ruth, who delivered it with the specific expression of a woman reporting news she did not endorse, was that the new Hayes bride had arrived in a trunk full of stolen property and was hiding from someone important back east. The stolen property part was new and clearly Hester's embellishment, and Colton took some time in the feed store parking lot, being quietly angry about it before deciding that anger was not useful and returning the wagon to the road. He told Evelyn. He told her that evening after May was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table the way they sometimes did in the evenings now, with the lamp between them and the Wyoming dark pressing at the windows. He told her simply, without softening it. She was quiet for a long moment. He couldn't read what was happening behind her face. Stolen, she said. That's the word she used. Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, Evelyn let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was nothing funny in it. That's almost funny, she said, in the most specific way. What does that mean? She looked at him. The lamp made sharp shadows, and her eyes were very steady, and he had the sense that she was making a decision about something. The things in that trunk, she said slowly, are mine. They have always been mine. I have documentation proving they are mine. A pause. But there are people who would tell a very different story about that, and they have more resources for telling it than I have for countering it. And so I am here, and the trunk is locked, and that is the situation. He looked at her. Legal trouble? Legal is the wrong word, she said. It implies a court. Courts can be managed if you have the right lawyers and the right judges and the right... She stopped. The word I would use is political. It's political trouble. And the people making it are family? The slight tension around her jaw again. People who share my blood, she said. That's not the same thing. He thought about that for a moment. No, he said. I suppose it's not. She pushed back from the table slightly and looked at her hands. They were not, he noted, the hands she'd had when she arrived. The garden and the laundry and the ranch work had changed them. The gloves had come off somewhere around week 3 and had not gone back on, and her hands now had the beginning roughness of someone who worked with them. If it helps, he said, the people in this county who matter know that Hester Malone embroiders everything she touches. She looked up at him. Does that include the people who matter to you? Most of them. She held his gaze for a moment. And you? What do you think? I think, he said carefully, that I don't know what's in that trunk. And you've told me you're not going to tell me, and I'm choosing to take your word that whatever it is belongs to you. He paused. That's what I think. The expression that crossed her face was complicated. He had gotten used to complicated expressions from her. She had a range of them that he suspected she was entirely unaware of, the finely controlled surface, and then underneath it, in small and specific moments, the real thing. This one he couldn't entirely read. It was somewhere between gratitude and something more difficult. The expression of someone who has been handed a thing they'd stopped expecting to be handed. "Colton," she said. She used his name rarely. The use of it now registered. "You don't have to explain anything," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to decide if I want to anyway." He waited. She looked at the lamp for a moment, and then at the window and the dark beyond it, and then back at the table. "I won't tonight," she said. "But maybe. Eventually." "All right," he said. He got up and checked the fire and banked it for the night and said goodnight and went upstairs. And he lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought that eventually was a word that carried a particular weight when someone said it, and that the weight of it depended entirely on whether they meant it. He thought she meant it. He was not entirely sure why that seemed important. The garden produced its first edible result in the 7th week. 3 radishes, small but solid, pulled up by May in the morning, with the solemnity of someone conducting an important archaeological excavation. She brought them inside and washed them at the pump, and put them on the table, and the 3 of them ate 1 radish each at breakfast, which was not particularly ceremonial, and yet was. "They're good," May said, in the tone of someone reporting a surprising scientific result. "They are," Evelyn agreed. "The carrots didn't work." "Not this time." May looked at the empty spot on the plate where the radishes had been. "Will you try again?" "Yes." "Even though they might not work again?" "Even then." May picked up her fork and went back to her eggs. "Okay," she said. It was a word that contained more weight than its 2 letters suggested. A child's particular kind of acceptance, which is not the same as a child's particular kind of approval, but is in some ways rarer. Colton looked at his plate and said nothing, and ate his eggs, which were good now. She'd gotten them consistently right in the 4th week, and they'd stayed right since. It was the question of the blouse that cracked something open between them, unexpectedly and without planning on either side. She'd ruined one of her blouses in the wash. The washboard had caught the fabric wrong and torn a seam that couldn't be repaired with the materials she had. She was not overly upset about it, but she held it up and examined the tear with the expression of someone taking stock of a practical problem, and said, almost to herself, "I'll need to get something more practical anyway." "There's a dry goods store in Laramie," he said. "Mrs. Pierce runs it. She's decent. She won't say anything that isn't her business." Evelyn lowered the blouse. "Are you suggesting I go to town?" "I'm saying there's a store if you need it." She was quiet for a moment, and he understood belatedly what the hesitation was about. The town. Hester Malone's story. The people who had looked at her trunk and her suit and drawn their conclusions. "I'll go with you," he said, "if you want." She looked at him with that particular expression again, the recalibration one. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to. I'm offering." A pause. "Why?" "Because it'll be less uncomfortable if I'm there, and because Mrs. Pierce will treat you better with me present, and because—" He stopped. "Because you've been out here for 7 weeks, and you haven't gone anywhere, and that's not a reasonable way to live." She held the blouse in both hands and looked at it for a moment. "All right," she said. "Saturday." They went on Saturday with May, because May wanted to come, and because having May along changed the social valence of the trip in ways that were useful. A man and a woman and a child going to the dry goods store together was ordinary. A man and a woman going together without the child was a different kind of occasion and invited a different kind of attention. Mrs. Pierce's shop was on the main street, between the post office and a hardware concern, and the sign above the door was painted in the same hand that had been there since Colton was 12 years old. Mrs. Pierce herself was 70-something and had the organized intelligence of a woman who had run a business alone for 40 years and saw no reason to change her methods. She looked at Evelyn when they came in with the honest assessment of a woman who formed opinions quickly and then proceeded accordingly. "So you're the new one," she said. "Evelyn Hayes," Evelyn said. The name, his name, came out without hesitation, which registered somewhere in Colton's chest in a way he didn't immediately examine. "Helen Pierce." She extended her hand and Evelyn shook it. "What do you need?" "Something practical," Evelyn said. "Working clothes." I've been making do with things that aren't suited to the work, and it's time to stop doing that." Mrs. Pierce looked at her for a moment with an expression that Colton recognized as rare approval, the kind this woman reserved for people who stated their needs plainly. "Follow me," she said. May went to look at the bolts of fabric near the window. Colton waited near the door with the posture of a man who has successfully brought two women to a clothing store and has no further useful role in the proceedings. He was aware of the other customers, two women he knew by sight from neighboring properties, and a man from the tannery who nodded at him without warmth. He was aware of them watching Evelyn. He kept his expression neutral and his position near the door, and let the watching happen without acknowledging it. What he heard from where he stood was Mrs. Pierce and Evelyn talking in the practical shorthand of a fitting, about fabric weight and seam durability and what held up to washing, the kind of specific conversation that did not have room in it for anything other than the topic at hand. Evelyn asked questions he hadn't expected her to ask, about which fabrics took dye without fading, about whether the cotton twill would hold a hem after repeated washing, about the relative merits of button closures versus hooks for workwear. These were not the questions of a woman performing practicality. They were the questions of a woman who had identified a problem and was solving it. Mrs. Pierce answered them with increasing energy, and by the time they came back to the front of the shop, she was talking about a particular method of reinforcing seam allowances that she'd learned from a woman in Colorado, and Evelyn was listening with the genuine attention that she brought to things she actually wanted to understand. One of the watching women came forward as they reached the counter. "Mrs. Hayes," she said. The emphasis on the name was very slight but deliberate. "I'm Eleanor Briggs. My husband runs the Briggs spread east of your property." "Mrs. Briggs," Evelyn said. "I've heard Colton mention your husband. I wanted to say—" Eleanor Briggs paused, and Colton saw that the pause was genuine and not calculated. The pause of someone who has decided to say something decent and is gathering the courage for it in a social situation where decency is not necessarily the default. "I wanted to say that the things some people are saying about the trunk and so forth, I don't put any stock in it. People see something they don't understand, and they fill in the gaps with the worst version they can think of. I've been here 20 years, and I've seen it happen to plenty of women who came out here new." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Thank you, Mrs. Briggs." "Eleanor," a slight pause. "And if you ever want company, another woman to talk to, the offer stands. It gets lonely out here without it." She nodded once and went back to her shopping, and Evelyn turned to the counter and paid for her clothes with the care of someone who had calculated exactly what she was spending and had decided it was the right amount, and Colton saw, in the line of her back, something that might have been the very specific relief of a person who has been braced for something unpleasant and received something different. Outside in the street, she stood for a moment in the full afternoon light and seemed to be deciding something. "That was better than I expected," she said. "Eleanor Briggs is a good person," he said. "Most of them are." "And the ones who aren't?" "There aren't that many. And the ones who aren't, they tend to sort themselves out over time. Reputations work both ways." She looked at him. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "It's supposed to be honest." May came out of the shop with a small ribbon she'd bought with her own coin, yellow, which she tied around Agnes's neck with the solemn attention of someone performing a very important decoration, and fell in beside them as they walked back to the wagon. And Colton thought that the three of them walking down the main street of Laramie in the afternoon sun was a thing that could be seen from a certain angle as perfectly ordinary, and that the peculiarity of the situation only showed if you knew to look for it. He had stopped looking for it, somewhere in the last few weeks. He wasn't sure exactly when. The thing about the trunk and the locked state of it, and what it might contain, was that it was starting to matter less than what was outside it. The woman who had arrived with expensive luggage and burned his eggs and killed 2 rows of carrots and defended herself against Hester Malone with the cool economy of someone who had been managing people like Hester Malone her whole life. She was becoming a known quantity. She was becoming someone he could predict in the small ways you come to predict people you spend real time with. How she took her coffee, what she read in the evenings, that she went still when she was worried rather than loud, that she pushed back on things directly but only after she'd thought about them. He knew how she moved through his kitchen. He knew the sound of her footsteps on the back stairs at night. He knew the sound of the trunk being locked and unlocked, and it had stopped sounding like a secret and had started sounding like a habit. The garden came in unevenly over the following weeks. The beans finally took hold. The second planting of carrots produced actual carrots, small and irregular but unambiguously carrots, and May ate 3 of them, standing in the garden with the dirt still on them, which Evelyn allowed without comment. The tomatoes were struggling, and Evelyn had had a long conversation with Ruth about what to do about them, that had ended with both women on their knees in the dirt trying a technique Ruth had gotten from a woman in her sewing circle who'd come from Virginia and swore by it. The tomatoes did not ultimately improve, but the effort produced something else, which was the understanding between Ruth and Evelyn that had been forming since that first Thursday with the pie and the stove discussion, and had now become a specific, unremarked-upon warmth, the kind that women build through shared practical work and don't necessarily announce. Ruth told Colton, walking back to her buggy after one of these afternoons, "She's scared of something, still." "I know," he said. "She hides it well." "She's had practice." Ruth looked at him with that look again. "Have you asked her about it recently?" "Once, a few weeks ago." He paused. She said eventually. "Eventually's not a plan." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Ruth climbed up to the buggy seat and picked up the reins. "I'm not telling you to push," she said. "I'm telling you not to wait forever. Because she might be waiting for something that looks like, I don't know, permission, maybe." He thought about that after Ruth's buggy had gone. He thought about it that evening while he checked the stock and while he made the last round of the outbuildings before dark, the summer light going long and gold across the grass. The kind of Wyoming evening that made you understand why people came here and also why they stayed even when it was hard. He came inside to find Evelyn at the kitchen table with her mending, the new practical blouses already showing the beginning signs of real use, and May beside her, leaning against her arm in the way May had started doing, just leaning, easy and unconscious. Evelyn was talking about something, some story, and May was listening with her head against Evelyn's shoulder, and the lamp made the scene soft and specific. Colton stopped in the doorway. Neither of them looked up immediately. He stood there in the doorway with the outside air still on him, and watched the two of them at the table in his kitchen in the lamplight, and something moved through him that he hadn't felt in long enough that it took him a moment to name it. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was something more complicated, the recognition of something you didn't know you'd lost until you could see the shape of it in someone else's presence. He cleared his throat and they both looked up, and May said, "Evelyn was telling me about Chicago," in the tone of someone reporting a remarkable geographical discovery. He looked at Evelyn. "A little," she said. She met his eyes, and he saw in hers the consciousness of what she was doing, the smallest deliberate opening of a door that had been closed for a long time. "Just a little." He pulled out his chair and sat down. "What did she tell you?" "There's a lake," May said, "and buildings so tall you have to tip your head all the way back." "That's true," Colton said. "I've seen them." "You've been to Chicago?" Evelyn said. The surprise in her voice was real. "Twice. Cattle business." He looked at her across the table. "It's a lot of city for one place." Something relaxed in her face, very slightly, a specific thing giving way. "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat there for a while, the three of them, in the easy quiet of people who are not done talking but are not yet sure what the next thing is. The lamp burned. Outside, the first crickets started up, the summer sound that had been arriving earlier each evening as the season moved forward, and somewhere in the barn Walter settled in his stall, and the house was full of the ordinary sounds of itself. Evelyn reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. A small, unguarded gesture, the kind people make when they've stopped performing being watched, and went back to her mending, and May leaned back against her arm, and Colton sat across from them with his coffee going cold, and thought that whatever was in the trunk, whatever was coming behind her from Chicago, it was going to arrive eventually into a house that had a garden and golden thread, and a child who ate carrots straight out of the ground, and that this was going to matter when it came. He didn't know yet how much it would matter, or how soon eventually it was going to arrive. He found out 6 days later, when the temperature dropped 40 degrees overnight, and the sky turned the color of iron, and Frank came in from the north pasture at noon with his face tight, and said, with the economy of a man who did not waste words on bad news. "It's coming. Big one. Tonight." Frank's words landed in the kitchen with the particular weight that weather warnings carry in Wyoming, which is to say they landed like a stone dropped in standing water, the impact small, the ripple immediate and spreading. Colton was on his feet before Frank finished the sentence. "How long?" 4, 5 hours. Maybe less. Wind's already turning." Frank pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, which was what he did when something was worse than he was letting on. "I've seen that sky before. 91, remember?" Colton remembered. 3 days of whiteout in November of 1891 that had killed 40 head on the Briggs spread and 6 on his own before the temperature broke. He'd been younger then and faster, and he'd still lost 6. "The cattle are in the north pasture," he said. "That's why I came back." Evelyn had stood up from the table when Frank came in, and she was standing now with her mending in her hands, reading the room with the precision she brought to things she didn't yet understand but was working to. "What do you need?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Colton said. He was already moving to the back of the house for his heavy coat. "You stay inside. Keep May inside. Don't open the doors once it starts, no matter what." "I heard what Frank said," she said. "Good. Then you know to stay inside." He pulled on his coat and his gloves and his hat and checked the lantern by the back door, and Frank was already outside and moving, and the sky to the north was the particular color of a bruise in its worst stage. Deep greenish gray with a yellow tinge at the horizon that meant wind and snow and temperature drop, and all of it arriving faster than anyone who had not spent years in this territory would believe was possible. May appeared at the top of the stairs. She had Agnes in her arms, and she'd read something in the way the adults were moving. "Papa?" "Go back to your room, May. Get your blankets out and stay warm." He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at her. "Everything's fine. I'm going to bring the cattle in." She looked at him with her mother's eyes. "Promise?" He did not make promises he wasn't certain he could keep. That had been his practice since Clara died. "I'll be back before the worst of it," he said. "Now go." She went. He went. The first hour was work he knew, cold and organized, the kind of task that becomes physical memory after enough repetitions. He and Frank moved the cattle from the north pasture in sections, splitting the herd, one of them driving while the other held the gate. The temperature was dropping as they worked, not gradually, but in lurches, like something being stepped down deliberately. And the wind was beginning to pick up from the northwest with the sound it made when it was carrying serious weather behind it. They got 2/3 of the herd into the main barn and the south shelter before the snow started. It started the way those storms always started. A few flakes, sparse and sideways, the kind you almost didn't notice. And then in the space of about 20 minutes, the world contracted from a wide-open Wyoming evening to a circle about 30 feet across and closing. The wind went from carrying snow to being made of it, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in what felt like no time at all. "We need to leave the rest," Frank shouted over it. He had to shout. The wind had a voice now, low and constant, the kind that worked its way under every layer you were wearing and found the places that weren't covered. Colton looked toward where the remaining cattle were. He could hear them, but not see them, which told him something about the visibility. 12 head, maybe 15. The south shelter was full. There was the old equipment shed to the east, which hadn't been used for animals in 3 years, but had a roof and walls. "Get them to the equipment shed," Colton said. "You get them moving. I'll open the doors." He should not have gone ahead of Frank. He knew, even at the time, that he should not have. But the shed was 50 yards, and he knew where it was, and the cattle needed Frank behind them to move in weather like this. And the calculation seemed straightforward, in the way that calculations seem straightforward right before they stop being straightforward. He found the shed. He found the doors and got them open, and the wind grabbed one of them, and he fought it back and got it latched. And then he heard Frank and the cattle coming through the white, and he went around the side of the shed to help direct them in. The problem was the ice. There was a depression along the east side of the shed where water pooled in wet weather, and it had frozen solid at some point in the preceding hours. He couldn't have known that. He hadn't been to the east side of the shed in weeks. And when he moved around the corner at speed, the ice went out from under him with no warning, and he went down hard on his right side. He got up. He got up because that was what you did. And he took 2 steps and his knee went. And the going down that followed was different from the first one, slower and less clean, his body's way of telling him that whatever had just happened to the knee was not a thing to be walked off immediately. He grabbed the side of the shed and got himself to standing and tried the weight again, and the knee held. Not well, but it held, and he got himself around to the shed doors and helped get the cattle in. Frank got the doors latched. The cattle settled into the shed with the relieved stupidity of animals who have been frightened and are now somewhere enclosed and slightly warmer. Frank found his shoulder with one hand in the white and said, "You all right?" "Fine," Colton said. "Go back to your place. You're not going to make it to yours if you wait much longer." "You sure?" "Go," he said. "I'll get the last check done and get inside." Frank went. Colton would think about that later. That he had sent Frank away. That he had done it because the calculation still seemed reasonable. That the storm had been bad but manageable for the first hour, and he had made the error of thinking that hour represented what the storm was going to be rather than what it was building toward. He was 50 yards from the house when the storm decided to show him the difference. The wind went from bad to something else entirely. Not louder exactly, but more present. The kind of wind that stops being weather and becomes geography. The visibility collapsed to nothing, and Colton stood in the middle of what he knew was his own yard with no landmarks visible, and the snow coming sideways with enough force to make standing upright a conscious effort. He knew where the house was. He knew exactly where the house was. He had walked this yard 10,000 times. He started toward where the house should be. He walked for what felt like too long without hitting anything. He stopped. He turned. He tried to find the wind direction because the wind had been coming from the northwest, and the house was southeast of where he'd been, and if he kept the wind at his back left shoulder, he should be moving the right direction. The wind direction was not consistent. It was doing something that bad storms did, which was to spiral rather than blow in a straight line, and the compass that had always been automatic for him was producing no reliable readings. He kept moving. He hit the fence line, not the house, the fence line, and knew immediately where he was, which was 15 feet east of where he'd thought he was, and turned to correct for it, and then his right knee gave out completely, and he went down. He went down in snow that was already 18 inches deep and drifting, and he got his hands under himself and pushed up, and his right leg produced a sensation that was not pain exactly, but the specific signal that means something is structurally wrong, and the structure is not available for use at this time. He got himself to one knee and tried the other leg, and it held. And he pushed off the fence rail and got upright and took one step, and his body informed him, with the calm precision of a report being delivered, that he was not going to make it to the house on this leg. He was 20 feet from his own house. He was also, for the first time in 20 years on this property, genuinely uncertain whether he was going to get there. He got down against the fence because the fence was solid and stopped some of the wind, and he pulled his coat tighter and thought clearly and without panic about his options. The shed was behind him, probably 30 yards, and he had walked from it to here and knew the direction. The house was in front of him, 20 feet or less, and he could not see it. He could shout, but the wind was going to take anything he shouted and scatter it before it hit the walls. He shouted anyway. "Evelyn!" The wind took it. He waited 30 seconds and shouted again, and the wind took that too, and he pressed himself against the fence rail and tried to think of something else, and that was when the rope hit him. Not figuratively, literally. A rope end smacked him across the shoulder and then fell against the fence rail, and he grabbed it with both hands before it could move and held on, and it was taut and pulling very slightly, and he followed it. He had to crawl the last 10 feet because his knee was not cooperating with the demands being made of it, and the rope was a fixed line, rather than something being pulled toward the house, which meant it was tied somewhere, and he followed it with his hands until the snow in front of him differentiated itself into the wall of his own house, and the rope end was tied to the porch post. He got up the steps on one leg, and the door opened in front of him, and Evelyn had him by the arm. She pulled him inside. She pulled him through the door with the force of someone who has been waiting with their entire body coiled toward this moment, and he came in over the threshold and the door shut behind them, and the roar of the storm became the muffled constant of thick walls doing their work. And he stood in his own hallway in a spreading pool of meltwater and looked at her. She was not in her sensible new work clothes. She was in her coat and her boots, and there was snow in her hair and on her coat, and her hands, both of them bare, were red and shaking, not from cold, but from something else, the body's unwinding after a sustained and deliberate effort. "The rope," he said. "I found it in the barn. I tied it to the porch post." She was looking at him with an intensity that was not yet relief. It was the face of someone still in the middle of the crisis, still running on whatever resource had gotten her to this point. The other end I held until you called out. And then I went toward the voice. He looked at her hands. You went outside. You weren't coming back. I told you to stay inside. You also said everything was fine, and that was clearly wrong. Her voice was level, but not calm. It had the quality of controlled sound, someone holding a specific register by choice. How long were you against that fence? I don't know. 20 minutes, maybe? She made a sound that was not quite anything he had a word for. Not anger, not relief, somewhere in between those things. Sit down, she said, your leg. He hadn't realized she'd seen it, the way he'd come through the door, the weight distribution. It's my knee, he said. I slipped on ice. Sit down, Colton. He sat. He sat in the hallway chair that had always been there for boot removal, and she knelt in front of him and put her hands on his knee with an efficiency that suggested this was not the first time she had looked at an injury and was not going to be deterred by his being the person she was looking at it on. He didn't ask where she'd learned to assess an injury. He filed it away with the other things he filed away. It's not broken, she said, after a minute of careful pressure and flexion. But something's wrong in here. You can't put weight on it tonight. I need to check the barn before... Frank locked the barn. I watched him do it from the window before the storm closed in. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. Her hair was coming completely down from its pins, and she didn't seem to notice or care, which was different from the woman who had stepped off the train 8 weeks ago with her hat at a precise angle. The animals are in. The shed is locked. There is nothing outside right now that requires you to go back out into that storm. He looked at her. May? He said. Asleep. I checked on her 30 minutes ago. She's fine. Evelyn stood. I'm going to get something for your knee. She went and came back with the kit she'd apparently organized in the 3rd week, and he hadn't noticed until now, and she wrapped his knee with the focused economy of someone with a specific plan and sufficient material to execute it, and he sat in the hallway chair and let her do it because his leg genuinely could not be relied upon, and also because there was something happening that he didn't want to interrupt. She tied off the wrap and stood up, and their eyes were almost level, her standing and him sitting, and the hallway was full of the sound of the storm working against the outside of the house. You could have gotten lost, he said, out there with the rope. If the rope had come loose from the post, I tied a good knot, she said. Evelyn, I know what I could have happened. She looked at him directly. I made that calculation before I went outside. The knot was good, the rope was long enough, and you were not coming back on your own. He looked at her for a moment. You could have woken me, he said. She was asleep and frightened, and I didn't need help. A pause, and then something shifted in her expression, the composure giving way to something underneath it, the thing that had been running this whole operation. I found you, she said. That's what mattered. He didn't have anything to say to that. She sat down on the floor against the opposite wall with the abruptness of someone whose legs have just decided to stop working, and she sat there in her wet coat with her red hands in her lap, and the snow melting out of her hair, and the storm screamed against the windows. How's your knee? She asked from the floor. Wrapped, he said. Better. He looked at her sitting against the wall. Come sit somewhere real. In a minute. He understood. The body needed a minute after that kind of sustained effort. He understood it from the inside and recognized it from the outside, and he did not push. They sat in the hallway in the noise of the storm for a while, him in the chair and her on the floor, and at some point May appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown with Agnes and said, Papa? In a very small voice. I'm here, he said. Come down. She came down the stairs and saw Evelyn on the floor and said, Are you hurt? Just tired, Evelyn said. Sit with me a minute. May sat on the floor beside her with the adaptability of children who have learned that adults sometimes need to be on the floor, and leaned against Evelyn's arm in the way she'd been doing lately, easy and natural, and Evelyn put her arm around the girl without thinking about it. Colton watched that happen and did not look away. The storm ran through the night with the stamina of Wyoming storms, which had no consideration for the people inside the structures they were assaulting. The temperature outside dropped to places that Colton knew from experience were genuinely dangerous, and inside the house was warm enough but no more, and he fed the fire every 2 hours through the night, limping on his wrapped knee, While May slept on the sofa and Evelyn sat in the chair by the fire and moved in and out of sleep in the way of someone too tired to stay awake, but too wound up to fully let go. Around 3 in the morning, the wind dropped slightly. Not ended, just dropped, the storm pausing to gather itself, the way those storms did. Evelyn woke fully in the quiet and found him at the fire. She was alert immediately, which he'd noticed before. She didn't have the slow surfacing most people had from sleep. She came up all at once, ready. "The wind stopped," she said, pausing. "It'll come back." He put another log on and sat back in the other chair. "You should sleep." "I can't sleep through storms." "You almost did." "Almost." She pulled the blanket, May's blanket, which had gotten draped over her at some point in the last few hours, more tightly around herself. In Chicago, storms were different, loud but contained. The buildings cut the wind down to something you could hear without it getting into you. She was quiet for a moment. "Out here, it gets into everything." "You get used to it," he said. "Do you?" She looked at the fire. "Or do you just stop being surprised by it?" He considered that. "Maybe both." She was quiet for a while. The fire talked to itself. Outside, the wind was beginning to build again, the second act, which would last until noon tomorrow at minimum, and possibly into the following night. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "All right. Frank, the ranch hands, the neighbors who helped you in the blizzard in '91. She paused. "Do you trust them?" He looked at her. The question had a weight to it that was not about Frank or the neighbors. "Generally," he said. "Why?" She looked at the fire for a long moment. "Because I have been trusting no one for a very long time," she said. "And I have been good at it, necessary at it." She turned her head and looked at him directly, and in the firelight her face had the particular quality it had in the barn that first midnight, the real thing, without the composure laid over it. "And I am becoming less certain that I want to keep being good at it." He held her gaze. "What would you need?" She looked back at the fire. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know what I need, because I have been so long past needing anything from anyone that I've lost track of what that even looks like." The wind came back. It came back harder than before, in the way of the second act of bad storms, and the house groaned slightly against it, and the fire shifted in the grate, and May made a sound in her sleep and settled again. "When you're ready to know," Colton said, "I'll be here." She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I know." It was not a simple thing to say. He understood that. He understood that for a woman who had spent a long time trusting no one, saying "I know" to a statement like that was the beginning of something, not the completion of it. He fed the fire, and they sat in the storm, and May slept on the sofa with Agnes under one arm, and the yellow ribbon catching the firelight when she turned, and the storm did its worst to the outside of the house, and the house held. At some point he fell asleep in the chair. He woke at first light with the storm still running and the fire low and Evelyn's chair empty, and he heard her in the kitchen, the sound of the stove being woken from its low overnight state, the specific sequence of sounds he had memorized over the past 8 weeks, the damper, the kindling, the careful addition of heavier wood, the good strong smell of coffee being started. He got up on his bad knee and limped to the kitchen doorway. She was at the stove with her back to him. Her hair was still down. She hadn't repinned it from last night, and she'd put her working coat over her nightgown, which was an arrangement that should have looked absurd and somehow did not. She was making coffee with the concentration she brought to things she had decided to get right, and the kitchen was cold but getting warmer, and outside the storm was a constant sound that they were both, by now, inside of rather than subject to. She heard him and turned. She looked at his knee first, the professional habit of concern, and then at his face. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee in 5 minutes." He sat at the kitchen table. The morning light, filtered through the storm, was gray and flat and came through the east windows with none of its usual authority. He could see nothing through those windows except white. The garden was under it, and the barn, and the equipment shed, and all of it. "The cattle," he said. "Are in," she said. "You know they're in." "I know." She set the coffee in front of him and sat across the table with her own, and the storm howled and the kitchen walls held it out, and she wrapped both her raw hands around her cup, and he noticed, not for the first time, what those hands looked like now versus what they'd looked like in July. Last night, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said, for going out with the rope, for the knot. She was quiet for a moment. You would have done the same. That's not the point. I know it's not. She looked at her coffee. I didn't think about it, honestly. I looked out and the storm was wrong and you weren't back and I stopped thinking about it and started doing it. That's not nothing, he said. Stopping thinking and starting doing in that. She met his eyes. Something moved in hers that he wasn't going to try to name. No, she said. I suppose it's not. The storm continued through the morning and into the afternoon with the single-mindedness that was its nature, and they stayed inside. All three of them, because May was awake by 7 and had opinions about breakfast that led to a negotiation about whether eggs could be made without the stove being too cold, which led to a collective decision that they could and that May would be allowed to crack them herself, which led to a lesson about egg cracking that produced 2 good eggs and 1 spectacular failure that landed mostly on the kitchen table. That's what she did, May told Colton solemnly, pointing at Evelyn. I did do that, Evelyn confirmed. That is exactly what I did the first time. The secret is you have to commit. Commit, May repeated as though filing it away. Once you decide to crack it, you crack it. If you go halfway and then change your mind, that's when it goes wrong. May picked up the next egg with the expression of someone preparing for battle. She cracked it. It went in the pan cleanly, or close to cleanly, which was close enough. There, Evelyn said. That's it. Colton watched from the table and thought about committing to things, the way she'd said it. Once you decide, and thought that was probably not only about eggs. By afternoon, the storm had blown through its worst and the wind was dropping by degrees towards something manageable. The snow was done, or near enough done. What was falling now was residual, the sky emptying its last hold, and the temperature was coming up from its worst, which had been brutal. He went out in the mid-afternoon on his bad knee to check on the animals, with Frank's help. Frank had appeared at the back door 2 hours after dawn, sheepish and frostbitten on the ears but otherwise intact, and the barn was in order, and the equipment shed was in order, and most of what needed to be dug out would wait for tomorrow. He came back in to find Evelyn and May at the kitchen table with a deck of cards, arguing with good-natured specificity about the rules of a game that May appeared to have invented in the course of playing it. That's not a rule, Evelyn said. I made it a rule. You can't make rules after the game is started. Why not? Because then everyone would just make up rules whenever they were losing. May considered this. What if you make the rule before you're losing? That's still mid-game. But I wasn't losing yet. Evelyn looked up and found Colton in the doorway, and she looked at him with an expression that was almost helplessness and almost laughter, and he felt, standing there in his wet coat in the doorway of his kitchen, with his knee aching and the storm on its way out, and his cattle accounted for, and his daughter arguing about card game rules with a woman who had walked into a whiteout blizzard with a rope, a particular and specific peace, not happiness. Or not only happiness, something more durable than that, the kind of feeling that has survived a hard night and is still there in the morning. Who's winning? He asked. That depends, Evelyn said, on whether we allow mid-game rule changes. We do, May said firmly. Then May, Evelyn said, by a significant margin. He hung up his coat and sat down at the table, and May dealt him in without asking, with the easy assumption of a child who no longer questions whether someone belongs. And outside, the last of the storm moved east across the territory, and the house settled into the quiet evening sounds of itself. The knee took 3 weeks to come right, not 3 weeks of rest. That was not a thing the ranch permitted, and Colton was not a person who permitted it to himself either. But 3 weeks of reduced capacity, of favoring the right leg with the constant low-level awareness of something that was not working the way it was supposed to work, of Frank taking the jobs that required full mobility, and Colton taking the ones that required experience and judgment, which was its own kind of usefulness, but not the kind he was accustomed to. Evelyn checked it every other day with the same careful efficiency she'd shown that first night. She did not make a ceremony of it, and she did not ask how he was feeling, which he appreciated more than he would have said. She pressed the knee, checked the swelling, asked him to flex and extend, and either said good or said still too much and moved on to the next thing on her list. He did not ask where she'd learned to assess joints. He had a growing catalog of questions he was not asking, and this one went in with the others. The storm had changed something between them. Not dramatically. There was no single conversation that could be pointed to, no declared threshold crossed. But the quality of the silence between them was different. Silences that had been careful before were easier now, less full of things not being said, and more simply the comfortable quiet of people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side of it with a shared understanding that doesn't require words to maintain. May noticed. Children notice everything, and May was more observant than most, and she noticed the change with the particular calibrated attention of a child who has been the primary observer of two adults for 2 years and has developed strong pattern recognition skills as a result. She didn't say anything about it directly, which was also characteristic. She absorbed the information and filed it and let the adults work out their own business in their own time. What she did do was stop bringing Agnes to the supper table and start leaving her on the windowsill in her room. It was a small thing. Colton noticed it and didn't say anything and thought that May knew something he was still in the process of working out. The second week after the storm, 2 things happened almost simultaneously, which was not coincidence but timing, the way life occasionally stacks its complications. The first was that a letter arrived. It came in the Wednesday post, and Frank brought it out with the week's supplies. And it was addressed to Evelyn in a handwriting that was formal and precise and used her full name, Miss Evelyn Margaret Ashcroft, which was not the name on any letter she had received in this house, because she had received no letters. The return address was a law office in Chicago, and the name of the firm meant nothing to Colton, but the quality of the envelope did. It was expensive paper, the kind of paper that accompanied serious communications. He left it on the kitchen table where she would see it. She saw it when she came in from the garden, and she stopped when she saw it, in the way she stopped when something required full attention, the whole body going momentarily still. She picked it up and read the address, and her face did the thing he had learned to watch for, the control coming down over whatever was happening underneath. She put it in her coat pocket without opening it. "You don't have to," he started. "Later," she said. Her voice was level. "I'll read it later." She went upstairs. He did not hear the trunk being unlocked, which was unusual. He heard her room door close, and then he heard nothing for a long time. And when she came back down 40 minutes later, she was composed in the slightly too precise way of someone who has taken deliberate steps to be composed, rather than simply being it. She made coffee and sat at the table, and he sat across from her and did not ask. "My uncle is dead," she said. He waited. "He was not a good man." She said it without inflection. "He was also the last person standing between me and a legal situation that has been pending for 14 months. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "His lawyers are informing me of his death as a courtesy, apparently, because the matter of my father's estate, which my uncle contested, will now revert." She paused. "It will now revert to the terms my father originally set." "Which are?" She looked at him steadily. "Which leave everything to me." He let that sit for a moment. "Everything is significant," she said. "Evelyn." "I know." She looked at the table. "I know I should have told you before this. I know the situation I put you in, letting you think you were taking in a practical woman with limited means who needed a fresh start, and what I actually—" She stopped. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "That's not true." She looked up at him, and the composure had developed a specific fault line, not crumbling, but present, visible. "You took me in. You gave me this, your house, your name when I needed it in town, the benefit of your trust when there was no reason for you to extend it." She stopped again. "You deserve to know what you actually took in." "Tell me," he said. Not demanding, just open. She took a breath. Then she got up and went upstairs and came back down with the trunk key, and she set it on the table between them. "Come with me," she said. He came. They went upstairs to her room, and she unlocked the trunk, all 3 locks in sequence, the motion practiced but never casual, and lifted the lid, and he looked inside. He had expected money. He had been prepared for money in significant quantities, based on the accumulated evidence of the past months, and he was right that money was there. Bank drafts and promissory notes and documents he recognized as financial instruments without being able to immediately read their values. though the values were clearly large. What he had not expected were the other things. The trunk was organized with a precision that reflected extended time and serious intent, not the packing of someone who had grabbed what they could and run, but the preparation of someone who had known this day was coming and had spent time making sure she was ready for it. One full side of the trunk was documents, organized in flat leather folders, each one labeled in that same engraved handwriting in a system he could see the logic of at a glance. Legal documents at the top, financial records beneath them. Below those, correspondence, organized by sender he could see and by date. The other side was personal. A small portrait in a silver frame of a man with Evelyn's eyes and a formal expression which was obviously her father. A woman's jewel box that was shut and had the look of something not opened often. 2 books he didn't recognize the titles of, a small bundled stack of letters tied with ribbon, which were a different kind than the filed correspondence, and the gold thread. A whole spool of it, not the small piece she'd taken out to fix Agnes, a full spool sitting in the corner of the trunk. He looked at the thread and then at her. "It was my mother's," she said. "She did embroidery. I brought it because it was hers, not because I thought I'd use it." He nodded. She lifted out the top folder of documents and held it out to him. He took it and opened it and read enough in the first 2 pages to understand the broad shape of what he was looking at. Her father, Aldous Reginald Ashcroft, had been the principal owner of 3 interconnected industrial concerns in Chicago, all of them established over 30 years of business that the documents described in the specific language of legal precision. On his death, the estate, the entire estate, all 3 companies and their assets and the real property holdings and the financial accounts, passed to his only surviving child, which was Evelyn. Her father's younger brother, a man named Prescott Ashcroft, had contested this. He looked up from the document. On what grounds? Several. She was watching him read with the expression of someone who has carried a thing alone for a very long time and is watching someone else pick it up for the first time, which is a complicated thing to watch. The first was that my father was not of sound mind when he made the will. The second was that I was not capable of managing the concerns, on account of being a woman. The third, she paused. The third was an attempt to have me declared legally incompetent. The kitchen downstairs was quiet. May was outside with Frank, helping with the lesser and safer version of post-storm cleanup that Frank had organized specifically to give her something to do. The house was very still. "How close did that come?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Close enough that my uncle had arranged a room at an institution in Springfield. Close enough that the papers had been drafted." Her jaw tightened slightly. "Close enough that I had a week's warning from my father's attorney, a man named Hadlow, who had the decency to tell me what was happening before the appointment that was going to result in my being taken from my house." He set the document folder down on the lid of the trunk. "And you ran." "I did not run," she said, with a precision that was not anger, but something adjacent to it. "I planned. I had 2 weeks. I organized the documents I would need to contest the estate claim when the time came. I secured the financial instruments. I arranged the most protected form of disappearance I could identify, which was the one form my uncle would never think to look for because it would never occur to him that a woman of my position would do it." Yisam Gin Nanju Muskin, a slight pause. "A mail-order bride in Wyoming." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You wrote 3 sentences." She blinked. "What?" "Your letter to the matrimonial agency. 3 sentences." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, exactly. "I wrote 8 drafts," she said. 8 drafts of an application letter, trying to sound like a woman of limited means without resources. And after the 8th draft, I decided that the shorter I made it, the more plausible it would be. And so I cut it down to 3 sentences and sent it before I could write a 9th. He looked at her. "The part about being capable of managing a household was a significant exaggeration at the time of writing," she said. "I am aware." "You didn't know how to cook." "I knew the theory of cooking." "You killed 2 rows of carrots." "I replanted them." He picked up the document folder again and looked at the top page, at the figures that appeared in the 3rd paragraph, and the figures were the kind of figures that changed the character of a conversation. He looked at them for long enough to be certain he was reading them correctly, and then he set the folder back down on the trunk. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. "This is, I know what it is. He looked at her. She was watching him with a care that he recognized as the same care she'd had in the kitchen that Saturday night when she'd asked him what he thought about the trunk. Watching for what he was going to do with information, whether the information was going to change something. I'm not interested in it, he said. She said nothing. I mean that specifically, he said. I'm not telling you it doesn't matter or that it's irrelevant. I understand what those numbers mean. I'm telling you that they don't change my opinion of this situation in the way you might be expecting them to. She still said nothing, but something in her face was listening very carefully. The woman who went out in that storm with a rope, he said, is the same woman who came off that train with a trunk full of secrets, and she's the same woman who burned my eggs and killed those carrots and fixed May's doll with gold thread. The numbers in that folder don't change any of those things. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very steady. He had an idea that she was deciding something in the specific way she made decisions, carefully, fully, without a lot of outward display. The third lock on the trunk, he said, because something had been sitting in the back of his mind for weeks, and the open trunk had brought it forward. The bank drafts and the documents, 2 locks cover those. What does the third lock cover? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached into the trunk and lifted out a flat leather case from beneath the financial folders and opened it. Inside, in oilskin wrapping, was a ledger. He looked at it. What's in it? My uncle's business records, she said. The real ones, not the ones he filed with the courts or showed to his lawyers or presented to the banks. She set the case on the lid of the trunk. The ones that show what he was actually doing with the portions of my father's business that he controlled after my father's illness began. He looked at the ledger, then at her. How did you get those? Hadlow, she said. My father's attorney. He had been keeping them for 2 years, waiting. A pause. He was a careful man. He believed in documentation. What do they show? Fraud, she said plainly. Systematic diversion of company funds into private accounts. Falsified records. Bribes paid to 2 officials in the county clerk's office to delay the probate proceedings long enough to allow the incompetency claim to proceed. She paused. And 1 payment, a single payment, large enough to be unmistakable. To the physician who signed the incompetency assessment. The room was very quiet. You have evidence of all of this, Colton said. I have original documents, she said. Originals, not copies. The originals that my uncle believed were destroyed. He looked at the ledger in its oilskin wrapping, and at the organized folders of documents, and at the bank drafts, and at the small portrait of her father with her eyes. He thought about the 3 locks on the trunk, and the key she wore under her collar at all times, and the way she'd gone still on that Saturday night when he'd said he thought someone was coming looking for her. Prescott Ashcroft, he said. Is he the one who would have come looking? He would have sent someone, she said. He would not have come himself. He was not that kind of man. A pause, and then the particular flatness returned to her voice. He was the kind of man who arranged institutions and forged assessments and bribed clerks, and then stayed in his office and signed papers that other people handed him. And now he's dead. He had a bad heart, she said. He'd had it for years. I was told, Hadlow wrote to me 3 months ago, through a forwarding address, that Prescott's heart had been worsening. This letter confirms what Hadlow expected. He looked at the letter from the Chicago law firm, still sitting on the dresser where she'd placed it when she'd brought the trunk key down. The lawyers in this letter, are they Hadlow's people? No, they're Prescott's firm. They're informing me of his death as a legal courtesy because I'm the estate's primary claimant. They have a financial interest in resolving the matter. She looked at the letter. They don't know about the ledger. Does Hadlow still have copies? Hadlow has the copies I made before I left. I have the originals. He sat back against the wall and thought about the shape of what she'd done. Not impulsively, not in panic. 2 weeks of planning during which she had identified the most important documents, secured financial instruments against access while she was absent, obtained original evidence from a man she trusted, and arranged the most unlikely form of disappearance she could construct, and then wrote 3 sentences to a matrimonial agency and got on a train. You knew, he said, when you wrote those 3 sentences, you knew you were going to come here, get to a place where you were safe enough, and wait. She looked at him steadily. Yes. Wait for what? For Prescott to die. or for Hadlow to tell me that the legal situation had changed enough that I could pursue the contest without the risk of the incompetency claim being used against me while the proceedings were active. She paused. My uncle was 71 and had a bad heart and no other legitimate claim on my father's estate. It was a question of time. How long were you prepared to wait? She considered this. As long as necessary. He thought about that. About a woman who had looked at a problem of that scale and decided that patience and documentation and the willingness to disappear were the correct tools, and had deployed all three with the organized precision he'd been watching in his kitchen and his garden for 10 weeks. What happens now? He asked. I write to Hadlow, she said. I inform him that I'm prepared to proceed with the estate contest. I send copies of the key documents, which I will do through a legal contact here in Wyoming to establish provenance. And then... She stopped. And then? He said. She looked at him with the specific expression he'd come to read as Evelyn Ashcroft in the process of being honest about something difficult. And then the question of what happens here becomes relevant, she said carefully. He looked at her. The reason I came here is resolved, she said. Or it will be when the legal process runs its course. The reason I stayed... She stopped. She looked at her hands and then at the trunk and then at him. Is different. The house was quiet around them. Downstairs, the clock his father had mounted in the front room marked the quarter hour. Outside, he could hear May's voice and Frank's lower one, the sound of post-storm work proceeding in the pale November sun. What does different mean? He said. She looked at him directly. It means that I have been in this house for 10 weeks, and something has happened here that I was not expecting and did not plan for, and I am uncertain what to do with that, because my planning did not extend this far. He held her gaze. The woman who had planned everything, 2 weeks of preparation, 3 locks on a trunk, 3 sentences to an agency, was telling him that she had not planned for this house, for this family, for whatever had grown up in the daily accumulation of burned eggs and garden failures and storm ropes and card games with invented rules. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. Not right now. She looked at him carefully. And you? I've been here the whole time, he said. I'll keep being here. Something in her face shifted. The same thing he'd seen that night in the barn. The first midnight. The controlled surface and the real thing underneath. Only closer to the surface now than it had been then. She reached into the trunk and closed the leather case over the ledger and put it back in its place, and she closed the trunk lid and turned both of the bottom locks and left the top one open, which he noticed, and he thought that was deliberate. And he thought he understood what it meant. I need to write to Hadlow, she said. You'll need paper and a good pen, bottom drawer of the desk in the front room. She looked at him. Your desk? You can use it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, Colton. He nodded and left her with the trunk and went downstairs. The letter to Hadlow took 2 evenings. He knew it was 2 evenings because she sat at his desk both evenings after May was in bed, with the door to the front room open and the lamp burning, writing and crossing out and rewriting with the deliberateness of someone who understood that this document was going to matter. He went in once to bank the stove, and she was on the 3rd page of something, and she looked up when he came in and said, I need to describe the provenance of the ledger for the legal record. What's the correct way to describe how a document was transported across state lines while preserving its evidentiary value? He thought about it. I don't know that specifically, but Hal Deering in Laramie is a land attorney. He's handled enough complicated property work that he'll know who to ask. She wrote something in the margin. Can you arrange a meeting? I can ride in on Thursday. I'll come with you. He looked at her. You sure? I'm sure. She looked at the page in front of her. I have been hiding from a dead man's estate for 10 weeks. I think I can manage Laramie. He left her to it and went to bed, and lay in the dark thinking about the trunk with one lock open, and the ledger in its oilskin, and the figures in the 3rd paragraph of the first document, and the fact that none of those things felt like the most important information he'd received today. The most important information was that she had used the word stayed. The reason I came here is resolved. The reason I stayed is different. He turned that over in the dark for a while and eventually slept. And in the morning, she had coffee made before he came down. And May was already at the table telling Evelyn about a dream she'd had that involved the garden producing something that was not a vegetable, but also was not an animal, which was the kind of dream May reported with the absolute conviction that Evelyn had learned to receive with complete seriousness. He sat down and May dealt him into the dream narrative without pausing, and he accepted his coffee and thought that the house sounded like itself, or like the version of itself it had been becoming for the past 10 weeks, and that this was, despite everything, despite the trunk and the ledger and the figures and the lawyers in Chicago writing letters on expensive paper, a thing he wanted to protect. He went to Laramie on Thursday. She came. Hal Deering was a compact, competent man who had been practicing land law in Wyoming for 20 years, and who listened to the situation with the focused stillness of someone filing information in real time. Colton had called in a favor to get the appointment on short notice, and he was aware of the favor's weight, and he sat in the chair beside Evelyn's in Deering's office and let her present the situation in her own words, which she did with a precision that clearly impressed Deering in the way that precision impressed people who dealt in precision professionally. When she was done, Deering was quiet for a moment. He looked at his notes. Then he looked up. "The ledger," he said. "You have the original." "In a locked trunk at the Hayes property," she said. "Not transported since I left Chicago." "Good." He wrote something. "The chain of custody is clean if it's been secured continuously. You'll want an affidavit from He looked at Colton. "I never touched the trunk," Colton said. "She has the keys." Deering nodded. "Even better." He wrote more. "The estate contest itself will need to be filed in Illinois. You'll need a Chicago attorney for that. I can give you a name, a man I went to school with who's been practicing in Cook County for 15 years. Solid." He set his pen down. "The incompetency claim, since it was never formally filed, your uncle died before he could complete the process, based on what you're describing, that evaporates. There's nothing to contest there." Evelyn's breath went out very slightly. Not dramatically. He wouldn't have caught it if he hadn't been paying attention. Just the smallest release. "The fraud evidence," Deering continued, "that's a separate matter from the estate, and it needs to be handled carefully. You don't want to lead with it because it turns a civil estate matter into something with criminal implications, and that slows everything down and makes it more complicated and more public." He looked at her. "My advice. Get the estate resolved first. Once you have legal control of the companies, the fraud evidence becomes a tool you use from a position of strength rather than a claim you're making from a position of vulnerability." She nodded slowly. "That's consistent with what Hadlow told me before I left." "Your father's attorney sounds like he knew what he was doing." Deering picked up his pen again. "You're going to need to go back to Chicago at some point. Not immediately. You can initiate the process from here through correspondence. But eventually, to appear before the court for the estate proceedings. How long before that's necessary? 6 months minimum, probably more like 9. He wrote something else. "In the meantime, you file the initial contest through the Chicago attorney, you provide the documentary evidence through proper legal channels, and you wait." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm good at waiting," she said. Deering looked at her with what Colton recognized as approval. "Good," he said, "because the other side's lawyers are going to try to delay everything as long as they can. That's what lawyers do when their client's case is weak. They run out the clock and hope the other side gets tired." "I don't get tired," she said. Deering looked at her and then at Colton, and Colton kept his expression neutral, and Deering said to Evelyn, "No, I don't imagine you do." They rode back to the ranch in the mid-afternoon, the November sun already low and the temperature dropping in the specific way of Wyoming afternoons in late autumn, the warmth gone the moment the sun got below a certain angle. She was quiet on the ride back, but it was a thinking quiet rather than a troubled one. He knew the difference now. 6 months, he said at some point. "At least," she said. "Probably longer." He kept his eyes on the road. "Is that—" she started and then stopped. "Is that what?" She looked at him sideways. "Is that a problem? For you?" He thought about the most honest answer. "My knee is mostly healed," he said. "The north pasture fence needs replacing before spring. The water rights meeting with the county is in January, and I need someone who understands contracts to look at what they're proposing before I sign anything." He paused. "And May is going to need someone to teach her to do fractions because I can do them, but I can't explain them." She looked at him. "So no," he said. "It's not a problem." She looked back at the road. "I can do fractions," she said. I know you can. A pause. The contracts for the water rights. I'd need to see the current agreement before I could. I'll find it when we get back, he said. She nodded. Then, quietly, Colton. He looked at her. I don't know what I would have done if the agency had matched me with someone else, she said. Someone who looked at that trunk and decided it was their business. Or looked at me and decided the suit was more important than the person in it. She paused. I don't know what I would have done. He looked at the road. You'd have figured something out, he said. You're good at figuring things out. Maybe, she said. But I'm glad I didn't have to. The ranch came into view around the last bend. The house and the barn and the equipment shed and the garden's winter remains still visible along the south wall, the whole of it sitting in the late afternoon light with the specific character of a place that had been there a while and intended to keep being there. He pulled the wagon up to the house, and May came out the front door before he'd finished tying the horses. She'd been watching for them, which she did when she was anxious about something, though she wouldn't have used that word, and she looked at Evelyn with a question in her face that wasn't about the lawyer. Well, May said. Well, what? Evelyn climbed down from the wagon. You were gone all day. We had business in town. Evelyn looked at her steadily. I'm back. May considered this. Are you going to go away again? The question hung in the cold air between them. Colton stayed at the horses' heads and didn't look at either of them. Yes, Evelyn said. Eventually I'll have to go to Chicago to handle some things. May's face did something complicated. For how long? I don't know yet. Not forever. Evelyn crouched down slightly so she was at eye level with May, which was a thing she'd started doing around the 6th week without making any particular decision about it. May, I'm not going anywhere tonight, and when I do have to go, you'll know about it well in advance, and I'll come back. May looked at her with Clara's eyes. You promise? And Evelyn held the child's gaze and said, without hesitation, I promise. Colton unsaddled the horses and led them to the barn, and stood in the familiar smell of hay and animals, and winter cold coming in through the gaps. And he stood there for a moment in the quiet of the barn, with Walter blowing softly against his shoulder, and thought about a woman who had spent 10 weeks learning not to make promises she wasn't certain she could keep, and had just made one to a 7-year-old with all the conviction of someone who had made the decision long before the question was asked. He thought that was worth knowing. He thought it was, in fact, the most important thing that had happened all day. Hal Deering's contact in Chicago was a man named Edmund Crail, and he turned out to be exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted for a fight you'd been building toward for 14 months. Methodical, humorless in the specific way of men who take their work seriously, and possessed of the particular patience that distinguishes attorneys who win from attorneys who merely argue well. His first letter arrived at the Hayes Ranch in December, 3 weeks after Evelyn had written to him through Deering, and it was 4 pages long and dense with procedural language that Evelyn read at the kitchen table with the almanac studying focus she brought to things that mattered. Colton did not read the letter. She summarized it for him after May had gone to bed. The filing had been initiated. The initial response from Prescott's estate lawyers had been, as Deering predicted, a motion to delay, which Crail had anticipated and countered, and the court date for the preliminary hearing had been set for March, which was further away than Evelyn would have chosen and closer than Prescott's lawyers had wanted. March, Colton said. Crail thinks it could extend past the preliminary hearing. These things often do. She set the letter on the table. He's cautiously optimistic, which for a man like Crail, I understand, is the equivalent of another man saying he's certain. You'll need to go. For the preliminary hearing, yes. She looked at him. I'd be gone 2 weeks, maybe 3. He thought about this practically. Ruth can stay with May. I already thought about asking Ruth. She paused. If that's all right. Ruth would be annoyed if she wasn't asked. Something at the corner of her mouth. That's what I thought. December settled over the ranch with the quieter cold that followed the November storm. Still brutal by most standards, but manageable in the way that Wyoming winters became manageable once you understood them, which was not the same as liking them, but was a functional relationship nonetheless. The days were short and the work contracted around the hours of light, and the evenings were long in the way that long evenings can be either oppressive or something else, depending on who you're spending them with. They spent them at the kitchen table mostly. It had become the natural gravity of the house's evenings, the three of them, after supper, with whatever each person needed to occupy their hands. May had taken up a needlework project under Evelyn's instruction, a simple pattern on linen that was supposed to be a bird, but was developing in a direction that suggested the bird had opinions about the form it wanted to take. Evelyn wrote letters, to Crail, to Hadlow, to Deering, occasionally to a woman whose name Colton didn't know, written in a different hand than the legal correspondence, more relaxed, which he understood was a friend from before. He read or worked on the ranch accounts, which he did better in winter when there was time for them, or sat with his coffee and looked at the fire and thought about things he had not yet decided what to do with. He had not yet decided what to do with the most pressing of them, which was the fact that he had been sharing a house with Evelyn Ashcroft for 4 months, and had developed somewhere in those 4 months a clear and specific sense of what the house would feel like without her that he did not want to test. He was not a man who was good at this kind of thing. He was aware of that. Clara had been the one who moved toward things. She had been the one who decided, early, what she wanted, and she had not been subtle about it, and he had been grateful for that because left to himself, he would have taken considerably longer to get to the same conclusion. He had been 31 when they married, which was already late for a rancher in Wyoming. And the reason it had taken that long was not a mystery to him. He did not rush at things. He thought about them until he was certain, and then he moved. He was certain. The question was timing, and the form of it, and whether the timing he was considering was the right one given that she had legal proceedings in Chicago pending, and a trunk that was still not entirely unpacked, and a life that was, by any honest assessment, significantly more complicated than it had been 4 months ago in a different direction. He thought about it through December. He was still thinking about it in January when the water rights meeting happened. The County Water Rights Association met in the second week of January, in a hall in Laramie that was too small for the number of people who attended and too cold for the duration of the meeting, which ran 4 hours. Colton had been to these meetings for 15 years and had a working understanding of the politics involved, which were the politics of resource scarcity, the same fights recurring in slightly different forms as the territory grew and the water didn't. This year's proposal was a new allocation structure that redistributed access rights in ways that benefited the larger operations and disadvantaged the smaller ones, and it was being presented by a man named Garvey, who worked for one of the larger cattle concerns and was very smooth about it. Evelyn had read the proposed agreement 3 times in the week before the meeting. She had made notes in the margin. Her marginal notations, he'd learned, were the clearest indicator of how seriously she was taking something, because she only wrote in the margins of things she intended to fully understand. She had come with him to the meeting and sat beside him and listened to Garvey's presentation with her hands folded in her lap and her face expressionless. Garvey was 40 minutes into his presentation when Evelyn raised her hand. Garvey looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man who has encountered women at public meetings before and has a system for managing the encounter that involves being polite while minimizing engagement. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "did you have a question?" "A clarification," she said. Section 4 of the proposed agreement. The allocation percentages in the revised schedule. Are they based on the 1889 survey or the 1891 resurvey? A pause. The 1889 survey, Garvey said. The 1891 resurvey identified a significant change in the main channel's summer flow rate, she said. Specifically, a reduction of approximately 18% attributed to upstream diversion. If the allocation percentages in Section 4 are based on the 1889 survey figures, they are calculating shares of a water supply that is 18% larger than what currently exists. She paused. Which means the smaller allocation holders in the revised schedule will actually receive less than the agreement states because the denominator is wrong. The room was quiet. Garvey looked at his documents. He looked at them for a moment longer than a man who is certain of his position needs to look at documents. The survey methodology, I have a copy of the 1891 resurvey report, Evelyn said. I'm happy to share the relevant pages. The flow rate reduction is on page 12. She produced the pages. She had brought them. Colton had not known she was bringing them because she had not told him she was bringing them. But looking at her now, he thought that she had known since at least the second reading of the proposed agreement that this moment was coming and had prepared accordingly. The meeting ran another 2 hours after that, And when it ended, the vote on the proposed agreement was tabled pending review of the 1891 resurvey data, which Deering, who was also present, because Deering attended these meetings as a matter of professional habit, said afterward was the best possible outcome, because tabling was not rejection, but it was time, and time was what the smaller operations needed. Walking back to the wagon, Dale Malone fell into step beside Colton. Dale was a fair man, whatever Hester's habits were, and he'd been at the receiving end of Garvey's proposed allocation restructuring in ways that would have cost his operation significantly. "Your wife," Dale said. "Yes," Colton said. "Where'd she get the resurvey report?" "County clerk's office," Colton said. "She went in December. She asked to see the water records." Dale was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know the resurvey existed," he said. "Neither did I," Colton said. Dale looked at him with the expression of a man recalibrating an opinion he'd been developing for several months, and then he nodded once and walked back to his own wagon, and Colton thought that Hester Malone was going to have an interesting conversation at her own supper table that evening. On the ride home, he told Evelyn that he hadn't known about the resurvey report. "I found it in December," she said, "when I was reviewing the documents Deering provided about the proposed agreement. The 1889 survey was cited as the basis, and that seemed wrong given the visible changes to the creek bed, so I went to look at the records. And when you found the resurvey, I thought it would probably be relevant." She said it simply, as though this were obvious, as though going to the county clerk's office in December to pull water survey records on behalf of a ranching community she had lived in for 5 months was a natural thing that anyone might do. He thought about what Ruth had said in the summer. Belonging is different from being here. He thought Evelyn had not heard Ruth say that, but had arrived at the same conclusion through her own method, which was the direct and methodical one she applied to everything. Identify what needs doing, gather the information, do the thing. She was not trying to belong. She was just doing the work of it, without announcement, without apparent awareness that it was notable. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something." She held his gaze steadily. She didn't say anything, but she was listening with her whole attention in the way she did when something mattered. He kept his eyes on the road for a moment, which was not avoidance, but the particular form of honesty that comes easier when you're not looking directly at the person you're being honest with. "I know the Chicago situation is unresolved. I know you have a preliminary hearing in March, and you don't know how long the proceedings will take, and you have a life there that you've been fighting to reclaim for a year and a half." He paused. "I know all of that." "Yes," she said quietly, "and I'm not asking you to decide anything about any of that right now." He looked at her. "But I want you to know that what I'd like, when the Chicago situation is resolved, when you're done with the proceedings and you have your father's estate in hand and you've done what you went there to do, what I'd like is for you to come back here." She was very still. "Not because of the water rights records," he said, "or because May needs someone for fractions, or because the ranch is better run with 2 people thinking about it." He looked at her steadily. "Because I would like you here, specifically you. And because I think we have made something in this house over the past 5 months that is worth coming back to." The road stretched ahead of them in the January cold. The horses moved at their easy working pace. The sky was the pale clear blue of Wyoming winter afternoons, high and cold and very far away. She turned to face the road again, and he could not see her expression for a moment. When she turned back, her face had the quality he'd come to recognize as Evelyn Ashcroft, after the composure has been set down deliberately. The real thing, unmanaged. "I have been trying to figure out," she said, "how to say something to you since approximately October." He waited. "The night of the storm," she said. "When I went out with the rope. I told you I made the calculation before I went out, and that's true. I calculated the risk and I decided the risk was acceptable." She paused. What I didn't say, what I didn't know how to say, was that the calculation wasn't difficult. It wasn't a hard decision. I went out because you weren't coming back, and the idea of you not coming back was... She stopped. She looked at her hands. "It was not acceptable to me, in a way that surprised me, in a way that told me something I hadn't been prepared to know yet. He didn't say anything. He let her finish. "I have spent a very long time making sure I needed nothing from anyone," she said. "It was a survival strategy, and it worked, and I am not sorry for it. But somewhere between the eggs and the carrots and the card games and the rope, she paused. I stopped being able to maintain it as a complete description of my situation. And I don't know entirely what to do with that, but I know that the answer to your question is yes. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, more simply. I'll come back. The horses moved. The cold air came off the fields to the north with the clean edge it had in January, and the ranch was visible ahead, the house and the barn sitting against the pale sky with the solidity of structures built to last in a place that tested everything. He put his hand over hers on the seat between them, briefly, without ceremony, and she turned her hand over and held his for the space of perhaps 20 seconds. And then the wagon needed steering around a rut in the road, and the moment moved on in the way moments do when they're real rather than constructed, which is to say, imperfectly, and with no particular awareness of their own significance. May was in the yard when they pulled up, wrapped in her winter coat and deeply engaged in a project that appeared to involve a stick and a very specific patch of snow. She looked up when they came in. "Evelyn," she said, "the carrots in the root cellar are getting soft." "I know," Evelyn said, climbing down. "I'm going to make soup. Can I help?" "You can peel." May fell in beside her toward the house, with the ease of a child who has stopped thinking about whether she belongs in step with someone and just walks there. And Colton unhitched the horses and led them to the barn and stood for a moment in the familiar dim warmth of it, listening to Walter shift in his stall and the wind work around the eaves, and thought about what Evelyn had said. I stopped being able to maintain it as a complete description of my situation. He understood that. He understood it better than she might have expected, because it was a thing he had felt himself. The way a life that has become defined by loss can narrow down to just the maintaining of it, the getting through, until something comes along that the narrowed life doesn't have categories for, and you have to start making new ones. The new categories were harder than the old ones. They required more from you. They required you to be present in ways that loss had let you stop being, and presence was not comfortable when you'd been away from it for a while. But it was better. That was the simple truth of it. It was harder and more uncertain and considerably less protected than the narrowed version, and it was better. He fed the horses and went inside. The kitchen smelled of soup in progress, and the windows were fogging from the warmth inside against the cold outside, and May was at the table peeling carrots with the focused determination of a child who has been given a real job and intends to execute it properly. Evelyn was at the stove, and she'd already hung up her coat and rolled up her sleeves, and she did not turn around when he came in, but she said without looking, "There's coffee." He got his coffee and sat at the table and took a carrot and a peeler, and May looked at him with the expression of someone whose professional territory is being entered without an invitation. "I'm helping," he said. "I was doing it," May said. "Two people peel faster than one." May considered the logic of this and found it acceptable. They peeled carrots. Evelyn made soup. The stove ticked and the windows fogged, and outside the January afternoon went toward its early dark. And the kitchen was the warm, specific self that it had been becoming all these months. The soup was good. It had been good for a while now. Not faultless, because she still over-seasoned occasionally, and had a tendency to add too many things when she was in a good mood, which produced results that were enthusiastic rather than balanced, but good in the way of food made by someone who has learned to cook, not from theory, but from the actual doing of it, which leaves a particular quality that theory never quite produces. May ate 2 bowls, which was her metric for approval. The preliminary hearing in March came and went before it fully arrived, in the way of things that are anticipated for a long time and then happen faster than expected. Evelyn left on a Tuesday in the last week of February with a bag that was not the iron-bound trunk. The trunk stayed in her room, locked, all 3 locks, which she had explained to Colton the night before she left, was because the documents were safer here than in transit, and she would not need them for the preliminary hearing. She'd said goodbye to May the night before because she was leaving before May woke, and May had received this with a practicality that covered something more complicated and had given Evelyn Agnes to take with her, which Evelyn had tried to decline and which May had refused to allow. "For company," May said. "I'll be fine on my own," Evelyn said. "I know," May said, "but Agnes won't." Evelyn had looked at the doll and then at May, and then taken Agnes with both hands. "I'll take good care of her," she said. "I know," May said again. She had her mother's eyes, and she had become, in 5 months, someone who said what she meant without elaboration, which was a thing she must have had from the beginning and had been waiting for the right conditions to use. Colton drove Evelyn to the station. The morning was cold and clear with the particular crispness of March in Wyoming, the winter beginning its retreat but not done yet, the snow still deep in the shaded places and the light already carrying a different quality than February's. She sat beside him on the wagon seat with Agnes tucked into her bag and the small case on her knees that held the copies of the documents she needed. And she was composed in the way she had been composed getting off the train in July, except it was not the same composure. It was quieter. It didn't have the same controlled quality of someone managing an impression. At the station, she got down and he handed her the case, and she stood on the platform in the March morning light and looked at him. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4. I know. If Crail is right about the timeline, the preliminary hearing goes well, and we file the substantive contest within 60 days, and then, Evelyn, he said. She stopped. Come back, he said, that's all. She looked at him for a moment with the face he knew, the real one. Then she said, I will, with the same quality she'd used when she'd said it to May. Not reassurance, not promise for the sake of comfort, but statement of fact about the future. She got on the train. He drove back to the ranch in the March morning, and the absence was specific and had a shape to it, which was how he knew it was the real thing. Not the vague, uncomfortable awareness of someone being gone, but the precise sense of a known presence removed, which is a different experience entirely. May was up when he got back, eating the breakfast Frank had somewhat ambitiously attempted, and she looked up when he came in and said, How long? 3 weeks? Maybe 4. May nodded once and went back to her breakfast, accepting the timeline with the practicality she'd developed for things she couldn't change. He sat across from her and thought that his daughter had somewhere in the past 5 months grown up slightly more than he'd been fully tracking, and that some of that was Evelyn's doing, and some of it was just May, who had always been more than the quiet child people saw. The 3 weeks became 5. Not because anything went wrong. The preliminary hearing, when Crail's letter arrived describing it, had gone better than expected. The estate contest filing had proceeded within the 60 days as planned, but the opposing lawyers, as Deering had predicted, ran the clock, and what had been anticipated as a proceeding of several months extended its initial phases. And Evelyn wrote letters that were thorough and clear, and that Colton read at the kitchen table and filed in the drawer of the front room desk, with the almanac and the water rights documents, and the other evidence of a life being actively conducted. She wrote to May separately. Short letters, specific, with small drawings in the margins. She was not a skilled artist. The drawings were frankly poor, but they were of things May had mentioned. Agnes, a carrot that had actually grown correctly, a horse that was meant to be Walter and bore only the most approximate resemblance. May kept the letters in the box under her bed where she kept the things that mattered. She was gone 5 weeks and 2 days. She came back on a Thursday, on the afternoon train, and Colton was at the station because he had the weekly supply run anyway. And it was not therefore a statement, it was just efficient, which was the kind of reasoning he was fully aware was not the whole reason, but was a sufficient public reason to act on. She came off the train without ceremony. She had Agnes in her bag and the case in her hand, and the same traveling practicality she'd had coming down from Chicago the first time, except nothing else was the same. She came off the train and saw him, and something in her face did the specific thing it did, and she walked toward him across the platform with 5 weeks of Chicago's courtrooms and lawyers, and her uncle's estate, and 14 months of fighting in her recent past. And when she reached him, he said, How'd it go? She said, Crail thinks we have it. The opposing lawyers filed 3 motions to delay in 40 days, which Crail says means they know the underlying case is weak, and they're burning time. That's good. He thinks resolution within the year, possibly by fall. She looked at him steadily. I'll need to go back once more, when the substantive hearing is scheduled, but not for months. All right. She looked around the platform, at the station and the town and the March sky with its advancing light. Is May with Ruth? She'll be home by supper. She nodded. Then she looked at him directly and said, I thought about what you said. On the way home and on the train, I've been thinking about it for 5 weeks. And I don't want to wait, she said, for the estate to resolve, for everything to be settled and decided and certain before. I don't want to wait for that. I've been waiting for 14 months for things to be certain, and the certainty keeps moving, and I think—" She stopped. She looked at him with a directness that was Evelyn Ashcroft at her most fully herself, the composed surface entirely gone. "I think that what is certain is here, now, and I would rather have what is certain than wait for what might be perfect." He looked at her on the platform in the March afternoon. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I know that," she said, with a precision that might have been dry humor and might have been simple fact and was probably both. "The ranch is hard." "I know it is." "May has opinions about card game rules." "I'm aware." The corner of her mouth. "I have opinions about card game rules. We've been managing." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "All right." She looked at him. "All right?" "All right," he said. "Let's go home." They were married in April, on a Saturday, with Ruth and Frank endearing and Eleanor Briggs and her husband present, and May as the sole attendant, wearing her good dress with the yellow ribbon tied around the collar, because she had decided that was where the yellow ribbon should go. The ceremony was short and civil, and conducted by the county judge, who was a practical man who made no speeches and used no language that reached beyond what was necessary, which suited both Colton and Evelyn. May watched the whole thing with the gravity of a child who understood that something important was happening and was determined to remember it correctly. Afterward, at the house, Ruth produced food in the particular quantity that Ruth always produced food in, which was enough for 3 times the number of people present, and Frank ate with the dedication of a man who intended to address the surplus, and Eleanor Briggs talked to Evelyn about the water rights situation with a directness that made clear Eleanor had done her own calculations about who in this county was going to be useful to know. Hester Malone had not been invited. That had been a careful omission that Ruth had engineered with the diplomacy of a woman who had grown up in this community and understood exactly how to arrange a gathering without technically excluding anyone, it simply being the case that certain people received a less urgently delivered invitation than others. Hester had found reasons not to come and would present those reasons publicly as her own choice, and everyone would understand what they meant, and that would be the end of a certain kind of problem. In the evening, after the guests had gone and May had been put to bed, she'd lasted until 8, which was better than they'd expected, and had fallen asleep with Agnes in the proper position and the yellow ribbon still at her collar. Colton and Evelyn sat on the porch in the April dark with the temperature at the edge of comfortable and the first real warmth of the year in the air somewhere under the cold. The porch was not the most comfortable place to sit. The chairs were functional rather than designed for leisure, and the boards needed attention in 2 places, and the view was not romantic in any conventional sense. The barn and the yard and the south fence and the garden's early spring stirring, the ordinary working face of the property. He looked at it and thought about what it had been 5 months ago and what it was now, and whether those were different things or the same thing differently understood. "The estate," he said, "when it resolves, the companies." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" "Crail will manage the legal transition. Hadlow knows the operations. I don't intend to run 3 industrial companies from Wyoming." She paused. "I intend to appoint competent people who can run them, and to maintain oversight from a distance, which is a thing that can be done with regular correspondence and annual visits." She looked at the garden. "My father built those companies over 30 years. I don't intend to dismantle them. But I also don't intend to spend my life in Chicago managing them when there are competent people who can do that work." "The money," he said. "Is a resource," she said, "not a purpose." He thought about what she'd said to him in the kitchen that first Saturday night. "People who want something I have and believe they have a right to take it." He thought about the trunk with one lock open. "What do you want to do with it?" She was quiet for a long moment. "The water rights situation," she said. "The smaller operations in this county are going to keep losing ground to the larger concerns unless someone is willing to fund the legal challenges properly. Deering is good, but he's one attorney in Laramie, and the other side has Chicago money behind them." She paused. "I have Chicago money, too." He looked at her. "And May," she said. "Whatever she wants to do, whatever she turns out to be good at, I want her to have the choice that comes from having options." A pause. "My father gave me every option. I didn't always appreciate that when I had it. I appreciate it now." "She's going to be good at something that surprises everyone," he said, "including herself." Yes, Evelyn said, with the certainty of someone who has spent 5 months paying attention. She is. The night came on around them the way April nights did in Wyoming, the cold settling from the top down, the stars appearing in the sequence they always appeared, the familiar sounds of the ranch at rest, an owl in the cottonwood by the north fence, the horses settling, the particular silence of a place that is exactly what it is, no more and no less, and has no interest in being otherwise. The trunk was still upstairs. He thought about it, about where it had sat for 9 months against the wall under the window, the 3 locks that had become 2 locks, and then 1, and then, in the month before the wedding, unlocked entirely, the lid opened and left open, the careful organization of its contents visible for the first time without the specific ceremony of being shown. She had moved the financial documents to the desk in the front room. The legal folders stayed in the trunk. The portrait of her father sat on the bedroom windowsill. The jewel box, which she had opened once in his presence to show him Clara's wedding ring alongside her mother's, sat on the dresser. The gold thread was in the sewing basket in the kitchen. The trunk itself sat open against the wall, empty except for the remaining letters at the bottom, the ones tied with ribbon, and the 2 books, and the oilskin case with the ledger, which would stay locked until Crail told her it was time to use it. He had said, one evening in March, that they should find something to do with the trunk itself. It was a good-sized piece of furniture, the iron bands and the solid wood of it, and she had looked at it for a moment and said she thought it could be a bench. She had said it practically, the way she said practical things, and he had not made anything of it, and they had moved the trunk to the landing at the top of the stairs and put a folded blanket on it, and May had immediately adopted it as the place to sit when she wanted to look out the landing window at the yard below. The trunk had been, for 9 months, the most locked and guarded object in the house, and now it was where May left her boots when she came in from the garden. He thought there was something true in that, something about what happens to the things that carried your fear when the fear runs out. They don't disappear, they just become furniture. They become the ordinary fabric of a life that has moved past needing them to be anything more. What he believed, sitting on the porch in the April dark, and he was not a man who believed things lightly or announced them, was that the things you build in the hardest conditions are the most reliable. Not because hardship improves everything, which was a romantic idea with limited evidence behind it, but because hardship removes the things that would have failed anyway. It clarifies. What's left after the clarification is what was actually solid. He and Evelyn had been introduced under false pretenses in both directions. He had expected one thing and received another, and she had been something other than what she presented, and they had both been managing uncertainty and incomplete information for months before anything honest had been said. That was not an auspicious beginning by any conventional measure, and yet they had built something in that uncertainty that had held up. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't, and would not be, and both of them were too honest and too practical to expect it to be, but because it had been tested early and had not failed, and that was more reliable information than any number of conventional beginnings could have provided. This was what he thought people missed when they talked about marriage and partnership and what made those things last. They talked about love as though it were a discovery, a thing you find and then possess, as though the finding were the hard part and the having were the easy part that followed. But the having was the actual work. The daily accumulation of it, the burned eggs that became good eggs, the carrots that died and were replanted, the storms weathered in the specific company of this person and no other. The slow and unannounced process of 2 people learning the shape of each other and deciding day after day that the shape was one they wanted to keep knowing. He had not decided to love Evelyn Ashcroft. He had simply kept choosing to know her, and this was what that had become. She turned her head and looked at him in the dark. He didn't know what was on his face, but she was watching it with the attention she brought to things she wanted to understand. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The trunk," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the barn and the garden and the Wyoming dark. "It's a good bench," she said. "It is," he agreed. She leaned back in the chair and let the porch hold her, and the April night sat around them both, and the house behind them had May sleeping inside it with her boots on the trunk and Agnes on the pillow and the yellow ribbon on her collar, and the ranch was quiet with the particular quiet of a place that is, for the moment, exactly what it needs to be. It would not stay easy. That was the honest truth that neither of them would have pretended otherwise. The estate proceedings would extend and then resolve and then leave their own aftermath. The water rights fight would take years and would not be clean. May would grow up and become difficult in the ways that all growing people become difficult, and there would be winters as bad as the last one and possibly worse. Colton's knee would never be quite what it had been. None of that was the point. The point was the porch, and the dark, and the woman in the chair beside him who had walked into a blizzard with a rope because the alternative was not acceptable to her. The point was that you chose what you built and then you built it, and that the choosing and the building were not two different things but the same thing done repeatedly, over time, until the thing you have is something that can hold weight. He looked at the stars, which were doing what Wyoming stars did in April, appearing in numbers that people who had not lived under them tended to describe as excessive, as though the sky were showing off. "You should have worn a coat," he said. "I'm not cold," she said. "You're cold," he said. "You're just not complaining about it." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That's different." "Not very," he said. He got up and went inside and came back with her coat and handed it to her without ceremony, and she took it without ceremony and put it on, and he sat back down and the night continued around them, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was the kind of silence that doesn't need anything added to it to be complete. After a time, she said, "Thank you." He knew she didn't mean the coat. "You already thanked me," he said, back in the beginning. "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you again." "All right," he said. The stars moved the way they always moved, slowly, in the direction they always moved, indifferent to the specific human arrangements happening below them. The ranch sat under the stars the way it had always sat, solid and functional and entirely without romance in the conventional sense, and entirely sufficient in every sense that actually mattered. They sat there until the cold became something that couldn't be ignored even with coats, and then they went inside and the door closed behind them on the April night, and the house received them with the ordinary warmth of a place that has become, through no single decision and no dramatic moment, but through the accumulated weight of daily choosing, home.